Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, all.
Hello, Chairman.
All right.
Morning.
I hope that everybody's well. All righty. Script reads thusly. In order to provide our technical and digital staff with notice of the hearing start, I am going to count down from 5 before calling the hearing to order. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. The subcommittee on energy will now come to order. Today, the subcommittee is holding a hearing entitled Securing Our Infrastructure Legislation to Enhance Pipeline Security. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, members can participate in today's hearing either in person or remotely via online video conferencing. Members, staff, and members of the press present in the hearing room must wear a mask in accordance with the updated guidance issued by the attending position offered. For members participating remotely, your microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noises. Members participating remotely will need to unmute your microphones each time you wish to speak. Please note that once you unmute your microphone, anything that is said in WebEx will be heard over the loudspeakers in the committee room and is subject to being heard by live stream and C-SPAN. Since members are participating from different locations at today's hearing, all recognitions of members, such as for questions, will be in the order of subcommittee seniority. Documents for the records can be sent to Lino Pena Martinez at the email address that we provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of today's hearing. And I want to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Again, good morning, all. I want to begin by acknowledging what an honor, a distinct honor has been for me to chair this subcommittee the past 3 years. And I wish to thank all of you who reached out to me with well wishes following my recent announcement that I would not seek re-election. It has been a real honor to serve with such a fine assortment of geniuses on both sides of the aisle. And I want you to know that we're not done yet. The best is yet to come. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you in this last year of the 117th Congress to continue to advance legislation that will help all Americans, from Appalachia to Alaska, from New Hampshire to Hawaii, and all in between. Turning to the topic that is before us today, I want to thank everyone that is on this call, that is in this hearing. I want to thank you this morning for joining us for this vital hearing on enhancing the reliability of our energy infrastructure and my Energy Product Reliability Act. The energy system that 330 million Americans depend upon for heat, electricity, and transportation is only as strong as its weakest link. And unfortunately, last year, in Texas, we saw this firsthand when our natural gas infrastructure failed, leaving 4.5 million Americans without power and costing over 100 Americans their lives. While the electric wires that bring Americans power across the nation are subject to reliability standards set by NERC, no such standards exist for pipelines. All Americans deserve reliable access to energy, and they need to know that the pipelines that deliver that energy are dependable. To achieve this goal, we must work together once again, just like we did in 2005 when we wrote and passed the Energy Power Act. The provision of that legislation established electric reliability standards and that it worked well. And with them, we began the work of ensuring that the electric system that Americans depend upon is reliable. My bill continues that effort. And I want to stress this point. My legislation accompanying this bill is not final. It marks the beginning of the legislative process and certainly not the end. I look forward to hearing what our witnesses today have to say on the bill, and I welcome any constructive suggestions from all members of this subcommittee. To my Republican friends specifically, I want to emphasize that electricity reliability is an issue that we are all concerned about. And for this reason, my staff and I are ready to work hand in hand with you. We're open to your suggestions on the best pathway forward. With that, I look forward to today's hearing and discussion. And I'm delighted to recognize right now my distinguished friend from the great state of Michigan, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Mr. Upton, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, thank you, my friend, Mr. Chairman. And we're glad that you've recovered from your COVID that you had over the holidays. We're glad to see you in person. And as it relates to your announced departure at the end of the year, you've had a lot of fine chapters in your life, and we know that this is not the last one. You've got a great book, and we're all proud to be your friend and know that you've got future chapters ahead of you. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee to provide their testimony today. Welcome back, Chairman Glick. It's nice to have you here again, and special welcome to the Deputy Secretary Turk to your first Energy and Commerce hearing. Look forward to working closely with you in your new role at DOE. You know, I know that many of us are deeply concerned about the direction of our country under this president's leadership. We all saw the economic report last week. Consumer prices and inflation rose 7% in December, highest rate in 40 years. We've got labor shortages in every sector, supply chain disruptions impacting the entire economy. Energy prices are soaring to 7-year high, and American families indeed are suffering. This administration's fossil fuel agenda is directly contributing, I believe, to record high gas prices and soaring utility bills as winter heating season is now upon us. The administration's response to surging inflation and sky-high energy bills is to shut down critical pipelines like Keystone XL about a year ago, and for Michigan, potentially Line 5, a ban on drilling on federal lands, forcing Americans to buy more expensive and less reliable electric cars and appliances. They're not really solutions. 2 weeks ago, a brutal winter storm hit the East Coast. 500,000 folks lost their electricity. Hundreds of drivers were stranded, maybe thousands stranded on freezing roads overnight. Just think what would have happened. Think of the people who could have died if all the cars were electric and people couldn't use natural gas to heat and cook. If it's not already clear to everyone we rely on fossil fuels, their day is not over. Simply put, the Fantasyland Green New Deal agenda of offshore wind farms, rooftop solar, and electric batteries are not going to cut it. The topic of this hearing is completely off base, out of touch with the realities facing America today. We need real leadership from the administration and the Democratic majority. America is facing an economic crisis, an energy crisis, and the majority has yet to schedule a legislative hearing on a bill to increase energy prices further and eliminate fossil fuels by shutting down pipelines. The bill today that we're going to be talking about is a sweeping power grab, preempting states and local jurisdictions from regulating all types of energy infrastructure, from the oil and natural gas wells to the gas stations where Americans fill up to the appliances in their homes. This bill would dramatically expand FERC, transforming a relatively tiny agency into a behemoth with regulatory powers over America's energy system. We're not just talking about interstate pipelines and the bulk power system that crosses state lines. This bill would impose new federal taxes, fees, regulations on all energy in the country. Americans are not asking for that bill. So with the unanimous consent, I'd like to enter into the record a letter from state regulators and the people who deliver energy to homes and businesses. Without objection, I would hope. The letters lay out specific concerns with the legislation, concerns that I believe are shared by many members of this committee on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Chairman, respectively, I would argue that we should focus our efforts on a bipartisan bill, H.R. 3078, the Pipeline and LNG Facility Cybersecurity Preparedness Act. We reintroduced this bill in response to the Colonial Pipeline attack last year. We still have important work to do to get the bill across the finish line. In October of last year, Republicans on this committee wrote to the Secretary Granholm to conduct oversight of DOE's handling of the energy crisis. We also wrote to Chairman Pallone requesting a hearing to investigate how the administration's actions are contributing to energy price increases. Everyone knows energy prices are the #1 issue right now, the highest prices in 7 years. Yet the majority has not scheduled a hearing. I would use today's hearing to confront the real issues facing Americans. What is the administration doing to slow inflation and lower gas prices? Why is the president asking Russia and OPEC to pump more oil while putting American energy workers out of a job? And why is FERC delaying permitting decisions on critical natural gas pipelines that would improve grid reliability and lower utility bills for every American? Those are the questions on the minds of Americans. They deserve the attention of the committee. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rush, for holding the hearing today on your important legislation to address the reliability and security of our nation's energy infrastructure. The need for today's hearing and legislation is driven by recent events. We all watched with concern last February as Winter Storm Uri devastated natural gas infrastructure in Texas, contributing to widespread power outages and significant loss of life, and some members of this committee even experienced the events firsthand. In the wake of the Texas power crisis, we held multiple oversight hearings. We learned that the power outages were caused in part by inadequate natural gas fuel supply and delivery, as well as Texas's failure to establish meaningful winterization and other standards to ensure reliable natural gas delivery. And those findings were corroborated by a recent joint report on Winter Storm Uri from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Among other things, this joint report concluded that, and I quote, generating unit outages and natural gas fuel supply and delivery were inextricably linked during the storm. The report recommended that a working group consider whether Congress should vest a single agency with responsibility for ensuring pipeline reliability. So I want to commend Chairman Rush for taking those recommendations seriously and introducing H.R. 6084, the Energy Product Reliability Organization Act. While members here today may have different perspectives on how to best protect our country from emerging threats, it's clear to me that the status quo is insufficient and Congress must act to ensure the reliability of our energy infrastructure. Given our current reliance on natural gas for power generation, it's critical we examine how we can best ensure our natural gas fuel delivery system does not again fail to keep the lights on. Unfortunately, Winter Storm Uri did not cause the only major fuel supply reliability failure last year. In May, cyber criminals attacked the Colonial Pipeline Company's business systems, ultimately halting delivery of more than 2.5 million barrels of petroleum products daily for several days. And this major disruption caused gasoline shortages across 17 states and the District of Columbia. The pipeline was restarted within 5 days thanks to leadership from the Department of Energy, but the cyber attack laid bare the vulnerability of our pipeline infrastructure. Chairman Rush's bill places the authority to issue cybersecurity standards where they should be, with energy experts who have a vested stake in the security of our power infrastructure. In 2005, after the California energy crisis, and the 2003 blackout in the Northeast raised concerns about the continued reliability of our electric infrastructure. And this committee responded in a bipartisan manner. We worked to create an electric reliability organization to oversee the bulk power system. By all accounts, Americans enjoy greater electric reliability because of it. Today, we're again confronted with events that shine a light on the inadequacy of our current regulatory regime. I hope we can respond in a similar bipartisan manner by establishing a stakeholder-driven entity like NERC or NERC to maintain the reliable delivery of natural gas, petroleum, and other energy products until we fully transition away from volatile fossil fuels to carbon-free electricity and transportation sectors. Now, this bill, Chairman Rush's bill, is of vital importance, and today's hearing provides committee members an opportunity to learn more about the scope and necessity of an energy product reliability organization. This hearing is the beginning of the process, and I look forward to hearing from consumer advocates, industry stakeholders, and others about how we can best tailor this legislation to safeguard our nation's pipeline infrastructure. We must find common ground on reforms to bolster the reliability and security of our pipeline and power infrastructure. The committee has a long history of bipartisan cooperation on these issues, and I hope we can work together to ensure our nation's pipelines and related facilities are operable during extreme weather events, protected from cyber exploitation, and able to address the evolving reliability and security risks of a changing world. So I want to thank our two witnesses, Deputy Energy Secretary Turk and FERC Chairman Glick, for joining us today. Look forward to our discussion, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Chairman Rush.
The chair yields back. The chair recognizes Mrs. Rogers, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement. Mrs. Rogers, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Rush. And as you've recently announced your retirement, just let me say that we've appreciated your friendship and the working relationship on energy and commerce, and look forward to you finishing strong here in Congress. Tomorrow marks the 1 year of President Joe Biden's failed energy policies, jeopardizing energy reliability, energy affordability, and America's energy independence. Today, Russia is on the verge of invading Ukraine. It underscores the importance of energy in national security. Putin wants control of the Black Sea to block American energy imports to Ukraine, the imports that help the Ukrainian freedom fighters, those that are seeking self-determination. This administration is instead helping Putin. On day one, a year ago, President Biden blocked the Keystone pipeline, but yet green-lighted Nord 2 for Putin. This makes no sense. Energy is so important to our national security, to our economy, to jobs, to competitiveness. The Energy Information Administration reported energy prices rose more than all commodities over the last year, 60% higher than at the beginning of 2021. And other projections show little to no prospect for relief. We have the highest inflation in 40 years. From the grocery store to the gas pump, inflation is hitting low and middle income Americans the hardest. What Americans pay for energy matters. It drives all aspects of our economy, touching every supply chain in every part of our lives. It matters to farmers who are growing our food, the manufacturers who make the products we need, the truck drivers who deliver them. It matters to the store owners who are struggling to keep their shelves stocked, the restaurant managers who need to keep food on their menus and the lights on. It matters to Americans who are stretching their budgets to feed their families, fill up their gas tanks, drive their kids to school, and get themselves to work. The price, affordability, and reliability of energy is foundational to our way of life and to peace and security around the world. We cannot afford another year of these failed policies. To understand the risks for Americans, look no further than the troubling example of current European and UK energy crises, the skyrocketing rates, upwards to 3 times what we have in the US. It's a direct result of radical policies that drove these nations to rely upon weather-dependent renewables, and increasingly, Russian energy, which threatens Europe. Thankfully, for our security, we've had American LNG exports, made possible by the shale technology revolution. These exports supported energy and price relief to our European allies and helped drive cleaner energy and power. But that's all being threatened right now. Energy security matters. It matters for economic security. It matters for national security. And it also supports cleaner energy systems. After a year of President Joe Biden's energy crisis, we should reset our energy policy oversight to focus on priorities for maintaining energy and economic security. That's why Republicans are leading on the Securing Cleaner Energy agenda. Now, specifically regarding today's discussion on pipelines, Russia and China will not stop their campaign to dominate global demand for fossil fuels. Nor will the real impacts on everyday Americans disappear if we ignore the harmful impacts of replacing pipelines with weather-dependent renewables. We need affordable and reliable supplies. And anything that we do that impedes affordable, reliable energy will be harmful to our families, our workers, and the nation. America's abundant energy supplies and world-class system of fuels and electricity delivery powers our prosperity, competitiveness, and ultimately our security. This is what ensures America's manufacturing and industrial competitiveness. This is what provides the strategic resources and the flexibility to confront our adversaries and assist our allies. And the pipelines that deliver these strategic resources are among the safest, environmentally friendly, and cost-effective methods. Today's hearing questions what is necessary to assure people have energy and power they need when they need it most. But assuring people have energy and power when they need it cannot be an excuse for sweeping, duplicative, and deep intrusion by the federal government into every part of the complex energy system. It's what this legislative proposal appears to do. And given this administration's record, I do not support this expansive authority. I look forward to working with the majority on this, and I hope we can head in a different direction. I welcome our witnesses, and I'll yield back at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. I would like to welcome our witnesses now that are present for today's hearing. The Honorable Richard Glick, who is the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And joining him is the Honorable David M. Turk, who is the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Energy. It's so good to see you again, and I want to thank each of you for joining us today, and we look forward to your testimony. And this time, it is my honor to recognize each member for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Before we begin, I would like to explain once again to the witnesses the lighting system for testifying in person. In front of our witnesses is a series of lights. The lights will initially be green. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. Please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red when your time expires. Chairman Glick, once again, welcome to you, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rush, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Upton, Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to appear before you today to discuss H.R. 6084, the Energy Product Reliability Act, which addresses the need to enhance the reliability and security of our nation's energy pipelines. I applaud the committee's leadership in working to ensure reliable energy supplies for the American people. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 gave the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission a key role in ensuring the reliability of the bulk power system. Under EPACT, the Commission certified the North American Electric Reliability Corporation as the Electric Reliability Organization. The ERO develops reliability standards which are subsequently reviewed by FERC, and the relevant entities must comply with any reliability standards that FERC approves. EPACT also provided for the enforcement of electric reliability standards, including penalties for violations. NERC and its regional entities may impose penalties for noncompliance, subject to review by the Commission. In addition, FERC has independent authority to conduct its own investigations and impose penalties on any entity that violates a reliability standard. There are currently 93 FERC-approved mandatory reliability standards for the bulk power system, 12 of which address cybersecurity. These mandatory reliability standards have made great strides towards improving reliability of the bulk power system. In contrast, there is no comparable mandatory reliability regime for natural gas and other pipelines that transport energy products, including gasoline and propane. The lack of mandatory reliability standards, especially for natural gas pipelines, poses a risk to the reliability of the bulk power system due to the interdependency of our nation's gas and electric infrastructure. In 2021, natural gas-fired electric generation facilities accounted for approximately 37% of U.S. electricity generation. If a pipeline failure or a cyber attack disrupts gas supplies, electric generation capacity dependent on that pipeline could be lost, possibly leading to blackouts on the electric grid. This is more than a hypothetical situation. As described in a report released on November 16th, FERC staff and NERC staff engaged in a joint inquiry into last year's massive blackouts across Texas and limited power outages in surrounding states during Winter Storm Uri. Although the joint inquiry identified several factors that contributed to these events, one of the primary causes was the lack of natural gas available for electric generation. The extreme cold reduced natural gas production and processing capability, and this impact was exacerbated because many of those gas facilities that were not frozen were unable to operate because they lost electric power. It isn't clear how well natural gas pipelines actually fared because there was limited natural gas to transport. To address the risk that disruption of natural gas production or transportation could negatively impact the operation of the bulk power system, the report recommends that FERC, Congress, state legislatures, and regulatory agencies with jurisdiction over natural gas infrastructure facilities adopt a new requirement for reliable operation of natural gas infrastructure. These recommendations include the designation of a single federal agency with authority over pipeline reliability. The challenges to energy pipeline reliability go beyond extreme weather. Last year's ransomware attack against the Colonial Pipeline illustrates the serious cybersecurity threat facing the nearly 3 million miles of pipelines that transport natural gas, oil, and other energy products across the United States. As a result of that attack, Colonial Pipeline shut down for several days, causing price spikes and shortages from Texas to New Jersey. A similar attack against the natural gas pipeline serving electric generators has the potential to also impair the reliability of the electric grid. In my view, it is critical that energy pipelines also be subject to mandatory cybersecurity standards. In fact, former Chairman Chatterjee and I publicly called for the establishment and enforcement of mandatory cybersecurity standards for pipelines several years ago. Turning to the legislation that is the subject of today's hearing, H.R. 6084, is similar to the legislation adopted in EPAC, establishing a mandatory reliability regime for the bulk power system. I would like to highlight certain features of the legislation that should help address the risks I have described. First, the legislation calls for the creation and certification of an energy product reliability organization similar to the process that led to the designation of the ERO. The legislation calls for the development of mandatory standards to ensure the reliable delivery of energy products. Although the EPRO is responsible for the development of reliability standards in the first instance, the legislation would provide the Commission with the authority to order the development of reliability standards and to require the EPRO to issue emergency standards if warranted. Finally, the legislation would provide the Commission with authority to review EPRO enforcement actions and to independently investigate and penalize violations of any reliability standard. I thank the committee for the opportunity to share my perspectives today. Legislation to establish and enforce reliability standards for the pipeline network will better secure the reliability of our nation's energy infrastructure in the face of threats such as extreme weather and cyber attacks. I applaud the committee for taking up this long overdue issue, and FERC remains available to provide technical assistance during the legislative process. I'd like to close my testimony today with a note of gratitude to Chairman Rush. As his colleagues has mentioned, he's preparing to leave the House at the conclusion of this session. Throughout Chairman Rush's 30-year career in the House of Representatives, I have admired his devotion to his constituents and his strong commitment to addressing the most challenging and consequential energy policy questions of our time. Thank you, Chairman Rush, for your support of the Commission and for your leadership. And with that, I look forward to today's discussion and answering your questions.
Mr. Chairman, you're muted, but I'm presuming that you're introducing Mr. Turk. There you go.
I want to thank you, Chairman Glick. Chairman, now recognizes Secretary Turk, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today to discuss the Department of Energy's role in making sure our energy system, specifically oil and natural gas pipelines, which is the issue of the hearing today, are reliable, secure, and resilient. And let me have a special thanks to Chairman Rush for his leadership and years of service. And I know everyone wishes you all the best in your future chapter in life.
Thank
I'd also
you.
like to thank Ranking Member Upton for your strong support of DOE for many, many years. Thank you very much, sir. And thank you to Chairman Pallone and Ranking Member McMorris Rogers for their leadership of the full committee as well. And thanks to all the members of this incredibly important subcommittee for your commitment to strengthen our nation's energy systems and for the trust and the investment you've placed in our department. Department of Energy is the risk management agency for the entire energy sector, and our dedicated team bring a wealth of unique expertise to do everything from helping companies identify cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the first place to addressing supply chain risks for the energy sector. As the President stated in his National Security Memorandum in July of last year, cybersecurity threats pose control and operation systems. They pose a threat to control and operation systems that are among the most significant and evolving issues that we face today. And it's why we need to work hand in hand, public and private sector working together. And there's certainly a lot more to do, and it's a crucial time for this committee to take on this issue, to have this hearing, to work on this legislation, to discuss and come up with a plan to ensure reliability and security of our energy systems that all of our American citizens, all of our American people depend on. And we certainly at the Department of Energy take this responsibility incredibly seriously to make sure we have reliable, affordable energy for all Americans. The Congress, especially this committee and subcommittee, have provided us and will need to continue to provide us the foundation and framework to fulfill this responsibility. We're grateful for your commitment to strengthening our energy security and resilience, including on the cybersecurity side. Shortly after the Colonial Pipeline incident, which I personally spent a lot of time on, and I know a lot of you focused on this issue as well, this committee introduced 4 key pieces of legislation on cybersecurity. And we very much look forward to continued discussion, not only in this hearing, but after the hearing on the Energy Product Reliability Act in particular. Over the last decade, the Department of Energy has built trusted relationship across electricity, oil, and natural gas industries, and with key state and local government agencies. We think it's absolutely critical to focus on the full oil and gas supply chain when we talk about energy security, the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. That's why we work daily with electricity and oil and natural gas owners and operators to assess risks, to share threat information, and to mitigate impacts. We work with owners, operators in 26 trade associations covering the entire oil and gas supply chain across the U.S. and Canada as well, and the 30 CEOs and trade associations representing the electricity sector. We work with the full range of our interagency partners, CISA and FBI, PHMSA, TSA, and of course under the White House leadership of Ann Neuberger and Chris Inglis. And let me say I'm particularly glad to be here with Chairman Glick for his personal leadership and FERC's leadership, providing terrific example of how to successfully coordinate up and down the full supply chain when it comes to the electricity sector. We all need to work together as an ecosystem to respond quickly and effectively to all the threats to our energy system, including on cyber security. We saw the effectiveness of this team approach many times over the past year. One example being the May 2021 Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, where our whole of government approach helped decipher the problem, restore service up and down the East Coast in a matter of just a few days. And we're ready to take action to prevent similar events from happening in the future. And we do need to think beyond pipelines as well. We have seen attacks around the world, including in Saudi Arabia on oil refineries from the cybersecurity side. We need to work together to shore up our defenses against all cyber threats and other impacts across the energy system. We need to simultaneously maintain security and resilience and affordability of all our energy systems while supporting innovation to address other major threats, including on the climate change front. DOE and the Federal Interagency are working day in and day out to address this complex and ever-changing threat environment. And we simply can't do this important work without the leadership and support of Congress, and especially this subcommittee. So in the coming weeks and months, All of us in the Department of Energy look forward to working with you and your colleagues in Congress on this important topic. Thank you, and I look forward to answering all your questions.
We have now concluded opening statements. We will now move to members' questioning. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of these very fine witnesses. And I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Chairman Glick and Deputy Secretary Church, again, thank you for joining us today. Chairman Glick, in your testimony, you stated that the lack of mandatory reliability standards, especially for natural gas pipelines, pose a risk to the reliability of the bulk power system in its entirety. You have touched on this topic before, including at FERC's opening meetings and in the wake of the release of the FERC-NERC Joint Staff Report on the impact of Winter Storm Uri. As a quick and unfortunate note, this is the second time in a decade that FERC and NERC have had to issue a joint report on the impacts of winter weather and blackouts in Texas, which we all agree is indeed a tragedy. Chairman Glick, could you elaborate for us on the threat that a lack of mandatory reliability standards for the natural gas pipeline industry poses to the reliability of the bulk power system? Or in other words, how the current lack of standards threatens everyday Americans' ability to keep the lights on in their homes?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I want to, as your question noted, I think the best example may again be what happened last February in Texas with regard to Winter Storm Uri. And recall, we had FERC staff and NERC staff engaged in a joint inquiry, and essentially there were 2 major conclusions as to what the causes were for the loss of so much generating capacity. They lost about 35,000 megawatts of electric generation capacity in Texas, which is a very significant amount. One of the causes was the fact that the electric generation plants were not sufficiently weatherized, and a lot of the parts froze. It got very cold, as we know. A lot of the parts froze, and they just were inoperable, and those plants had to shut down. But the other major cause was the fact that over 50% of the electric generation in Texas was fueled by natural gas, or is fueled by natural gas, and in large part because either the gas production was reduced because some of the gas processing and production facilities froze, but also because those gas facilities lost electric supply, and because of that they had to shut down, and they weren't able to provide additional gas, and so it was essentially a never-ending circle of problems, and that's what caused the problem. I think the issue is. We need to, and I think the joint inquiry said this best, is we need to have a system where we ensure reliable sources of fuel for electric generation, and that particularly includes natural gas. And
Thank you, Chairman Glick. Thank you so much. I do have another question for Secretary Church. Thank you so much. If you have any other statements, please share them with us in a letter. Deputy Secretary Church, one of my goals, chair of this subcommittee, has been to push for greater minority employment and representation in the energy-related industries. A study by the International Information System Security Certification Consortium found that only 9% of workers in the cybersecurity industry were African Americans. Given the DOD's focus on cybersecurity and the Biden administration policy to cultivate a federal workforce that draws from the full diversity of the nation. What step has DOE taken to increase minority employment in the cybersecurity role?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, not only for the question, but for your leadership on this incredibly important issue. And this is a top priority that we share at the Department of Energy, Secretary Granholm, myself, all of us. And we've spent a lot of time trying to make sure, not just on cybersecurity, but throughout energy, we have an energy workforce at the department and more broadly that represents all the talents of everyone around our country. The 9% figure that you highlight is just not good enough. We need to do more. We can do more. We should do more. And frankly, we're going to be more successful on cybersecurity if we do more hiring from a full range of our American talents. So we're doing an awful lot. Let me give you one particular example. We ran a 2021 DOE Cyberforce competition and inviting 21 minority-serving institutions to be fundamentally a part of that so we can attract more top talent to be part of the cybersecurity solutions going forward. So again, thank you, Chairman, Mr. Chairman, for all your leadership on that issue.
Thank you very much. The chair will now recognize Mr. Upton, the subcommittee ranking member, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Turk, when I was chairman, actually before I was chairman of this committee, I pushed, we all did, for an all-American energy strategy. Helped lead the effort to launch the North American Energy Independent Plan, which was in place. As part of that, we saw the expansion of LNG exports, which was mightily important both under the Obama as well as the Trump administration. Created thousands of jobs, sent the signal that we're going to increase supply, so more production, big role in reducing carbon emissions, not only here, but around the world as well. And I was reminded by my member, Kathy McMorris Rogers, that it was 6 years ago that I led a bipartisan trip of members from this committee to the Ukraine. And we talked a lot about LNG exports and the importance there, signal to the free world. And of course, as we look at today's crisis, the alternative to LNG exports from us is probably Russia. Not something that a lot of us are anxious to see happen, also knowing the impact of dirtier gas. This morning when I came in, I looked at National Journal, and I'm very troubled by a story here that says on page 1 that there's a long shot campaign, I hope it's long shot, to bar natural gas exports. And in the story, it references an anonymous DOE source that says there's been no change in our position on LNG, who requested to be anonymous to speak freely, told National Journal, we continue to have various tools in our toolbox, but a ban is not currently under consideration. Can you confirm that a ban is not under consideration?
Well, thank you very much, Ranking Member.
Presume that this isn't you that's quoted, but we'd like to quote you saying that the story is accurate.
I've been around DC long enough to know that it's not good to be an unnamed source for these kinds of things. You put your head down and do the work that you're empowered to do. And thanks for your leadership on many of these issues, including your leadership on methane emissions and critical minerals, which are we're focused on a lot, and really appreciate on that side. We've been blessed in our country with a wide range of energy resources across the spectrum. And we're certainly trying to, from the Department of Energy, make sure that with the support, and thanks for those members of this committee for support the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, which gives us an opportunity to push out even more, whether it's hydrogen or CCUS or electricity resilience, supply chains more generally. This country's LNG has been increasing for many years, and that certainly does have benefits, and it has energy security benefits to European colleagues, to European countries, to Japan, to a number of other countries.
So you would agree that a ban on exports would be a bad idea?
So we have been looking at the full range of tools that we've got in our tool belt for affordability. That's why we did the SPR release.
That's what this guy says. I'm presuming it's a guy, but I don't know that. This individual says. They're looking at, one of the issues that we're hearing about is that there's some effort perhaps to shrink the license time that licensees or companies get as it relates to exports. Is that one of the tools in the toolbox? I hope not.
So the way the LNG authorizations are set up, there's both a FERC responsibility and a DOE responsibility. It's congressional legislation that gives us both responsibilities in these areas. We're following the statute and requirements of that. The FERC makes decisions on the installations.
I'd
the
like to
LNG
get an answer
facilities that
before
we
my
make.
time expires.
So we take our responsibilities seriously. We're trying to do what Congress has told us to do and take into account the full range of issues that should go into national interest determinations on LNG decisions.
Well, I
more
just
generally.
think that the certainty of a contract and a license ought to be imperative to the companies as they make decisions that impacts
And I've certainly
lots
talked-
of money.
And I've certainly talked to a range of companies and understand the need for contractual certainty and the certainty that that provides not only our companies, but our partners abroad as well. And
All right,
we'll do what
last
we
question,
need to
knowing
do.
that I'm now under the 20-second mark. We have an issue in Michigan and the Midwest called Line 5. You're well aware of it. A number of folks have been waiting for a formal response from this administration as to whether or not this line ought to be replaced or not. Governor Snyder, 3 years ago, embarked on a deal, worked with PHMSA, all the different players to get the line replaced, which a lot of us would like to see to impact, positive impact on the Great Lakes. Can we expect a formal response to the court's request as to where the administration stands on replacing Line 5?
So the Department of Energy does not have the jurisdiction in that area, so I'll have to defer to the interagency and White House colleagues who do have that responsibility.
Okay, my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now understands that the chairman of the full committee has been called away. So now we will go to Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership and congratulations on your announcement. We're seeing the effects of climate change in more dangerous hurricanes, heat waves, and another year of devastating wildfires across the West. This is a direct threat to our energy system, and we saw that in February 2021 during the Texas winter storm that tragically took hundreds of lives. In this case, one key failure was that natural gas infrastructure was unable to function under the harsh conditions. It's not a problem unique to Texas or a particular source of energy. We're having plenty of challenges in my own home state of California with wildfires, drought, and the addition of significant amounts of variable renewable energy to our electric grid. So regardless of the technology in question or the extreme weather threat, we have to ensure that Americans have access to affordable energy when they need it. And we've done this effectively in the electric power sector through the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. So I want to applaud the Department of Energy also for the recently announced Building a Better Grid initiative, which will implement key pieces of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, including My Power On Act. These policies will make the electric grid more reliable, more resilient, and cleaner. And we can't rely on a piecemeal regulatory approach that maintains the resilience of some parts of our energy systems while neglecting others. We need common sense standards to ensure reliability across our entire energy system, from transmission lines to pipelines. And I commend the chairman for proposing legislation that would work us toward that end. Chairman Glick, I wonder if you could speak to the reliability benefits the North American Reliability Corporation, or NERC, has provided to the bulk power system already, especially against extreme weather.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. The standards have been in place essentially for probably about 15 years or so. Some of them have been updated more recently. But I think that they've been quite successful. I mean, it's hard to, there's been a number of outages over time. A lot of it really related to the local systems, when there's a hurricane and distribution lines blow down and so on. But if you recall, there were some significant problems with the grid before this requirement went into effect. In 2003, there was a major blackout in the eastern part of the United States. And so far, with these standards, I believe have gone a long way to avoiding those types of catastrophes.
I was in New York City during that blackout, and it was quite an experience. A lot of amateur traffic directors trying to get people through the intersections. Chairman, could you also speak to the address the status of the proposed rulemaking focused on transmission, and maybe elaborate on how the Building a Better Grid initiative could improve electric reliability?
Thank you again for the question. As you well know, because I know you're very active on this issue, electric transmission plays a very important part in terms of reliability. It provides alternative sources of electricity when a particular line is clogged or a particular line goes down. It provides certainly adds to the resilience of the grid to deal with extreme weather conditions, whether it be wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever that may be. And so there's no doubt that reliability benefits is one of the major reasons that we need to develop or build out a stronger grid. FERC has issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking last year, addressing a series of questions, how we're going to reform our approach to planning transmission, allocating costs for transmission, dealing with the interconnection of generation facilities to the electric grid, issues like that. And we've received a number of comments. My great hope is that we will have an actual notice of proposed rulemaking, which is a proposal to reform our regulations within the next couple of months. And my goal is to have at least to start with a final rule, at least on some of these issues, by the end of the year.
It's my view that we responded as a country responsibly to the outages we saw, like the one in 2003. What's your response to folks who say that there's no federal role with respect to a similar regime on gas infrastructure?
I think there's really two responses. One of which is that we, as I mentioned before, we have authority over the reliability of the bulk power system. The bulk power system is heavily dependent on the reliability of gas pipelines. And so I think there's certainly a federal role there. And secondly, we're talking about interstate natural gas pipelines, often interstate natural gas pipelines, which are subject to federal jurisdiction. And again, I think the states might not be capable, at least of addressing those particular issues and reliability with regard to interstate pipelines.
I think that's clear, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rogers, the full committee ranking member, for 5 minutes. Ms. Rogers, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Turk, your testimony outlines Department of Energy's responsibilities for preparing and responding to hazards, to risks, and to threats to the delivery of our nation's energy and power, and this is useful. The core mission of DOE is, after national security, is energy security, and we must maintain reliability and affordability. I would like to ask, is Department of Energy making recommendations to the administration on the risk of American disengagement from fossil fuels and shifting geopolitical energy power to our adversaries, Russia and China?
Well, thanks, Ranking Member, for the question. And I think just as you said, and I don't think anyone would disagree with this, we need to do three things at the same time. We need to make sure we have affordability for all of our American citizens, all of our American people, and we spend an awful lot of time on that. We need to make sure there's security, national security, energy security. And we also need to make sure that we're promoting and pushing on the sustainability side of things and making sure that we have a proactive, ambitious, aggressive plan to reduce our carbon impact so we don't have the impacts of extreme weather that we've seen all across the country this past year. Over $145 billion worth of damage caused by that.
Excuse me, Mr. Turk. Are you making recommendations to the administration on the geopolitical impact of shifting from fossil fuels to China and Russia?
So what we've been recommending all along is to both make sure that we're moving as ambitiously as we can on this clean energy transition, to have a wide variety.
Okay, I'm going to run out of time
And
here
at the
very
same
quickly.
time-
Excuse me. I'm going to move on. I have a letter I'd like to submit to the record to that I wrote to Secretary Granholm to oversee what DOE is doing to reduce dependence upon Chinese minerals and help develop domestic supply chains for these minerals. And I ask that this document be entered into the record. And I know, Mr. Turk, you have not reviewed this letter. I'd like to ask at another time for you to come and brief the members of this committee on the plans to develop more secure and domestic supplies for critical minerals, and technologies to meet the goals that you just outlined, okay? It's going to be very important that we are developing domestic supplies. Otherwise, we're going to be dependent upon China, and they'll shut us down. The previous administration identified vulnerabilities in the bulk power system chain from China and other adversarial actors. It issued an order to block components that put critical electric infrastructure at risk. This administration immediately rescinded that order and proposed a renewed electricity supply chain initiative seeking information from stakeholders. Mr. Turkey mentioned a set of 100-day sprints in your testimony. Is the electric supply chain security part of this sprint, and what's the status of your work to block components from adversaries that put our electric system at risk?
So this president has made supply chains and critical minerals an absolute top priority, and we're spending an awful lot of time at the Department of Energy. We've got now a dozen in-depth exercises, reviews, studies looking at the full supply chain, and completely agree with you, we need to diversify supply chains, including on critical minerals, including for batteries, doing more domestic production, more domestic efforts all across the supply chain, and working with reliable allies all across the country. So we'd be more than happy to come back up, myself personally, others from the department, and give this committee a full briefing and get your guidance and thoughts on how we can make sure we work together.
Okay,
to
I look
promote our
forward to
supply
working with
chains.
you on that. Thank you very much. China overwhelmingly dominates the global critical mineral supply chain, including 90% of silicon wafers used in solar panels, 80% of the rare earth minerals that go into wind turbines and electric vehicle motors. Do you have concerns that relying upon Chinese supply chains for energy resources and technologies could make our grid less reliable? And secondly, recent comments from an MBA owner made headlines over the weekend because of his assertion that there is a low level of interest in the ongoing genocide of the Uyghurs in China. Republican members on this committee have been highlighting the fact that much of the supply chains for wind, solar, batteries in China are made by forced labor of the Uyghurs. In fact, we offered an amendment during the Energy and Commerce markup of the Build Back Better, to prohibit the use of products made by slave labor, but that was voted down. I know you've highlighted environmental justice as a priority for you at the Commission. Do you think that the United States should be using technologies, including wind, solar, and batteries produced in China with forced labor?
So completely agree with you, Madam Ranking Member, on the concerns on the China front. On the forced labor side, and on having a surety of supply over time, including for these minerals that we'll need even more of going forward. And we and the administration, working hand in hand with Congress, have to get serious about actually putting in place the ability to build up our domestic manufacturing. Solar PV manufacturing is a great example. We at the Department of Energy, our national labs, funded by the Congress, funded by the American citizens, did all the groundbreaking work to get solar PV technology in the place that it has gotten to. And what we didn't do is follow through to have the incentives, make sure that we've got in place the manufacturing infrastructure to take advantage of that. And now all of that's moved to China and a few other countries around the world. We need to have incentives, just like included the SEMA legislation that's included in the Build Back Better agenda, to actually have incentives to make sure that we can do the domestic production that we need to. So happy to work hand in hand and make sure that we've got a series of incentives, a real plan to build domestic manufacturing, including on supply chains, including in all of these raw supplies and other materials we get from China. It's not good to be beholden to one country for these supplies, absolutely.
We need domestic, the steel workers in Spokane, Washington told me that a real infrastructure package would have included mining in the United States of America. I'm anxious for that recommendation to come from the administration to unleash. If we're really going to do this, we need to be honest about what it's going to take. I do look forward to working with you too. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now would like to recognize a man of two distinctions in the Congress, who's also announced that he will not seek re-election. He's renowned as both a member of Congress and also as the coach of the Democratic baseball team, none other than our friend, the representative from the great state of Pennsylvania. Mr. Doyle, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just let me say what a pleasure it's been serving with you in Congress over these past 27 years and on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I wish you the very, very best in the
Yeah.
future. I know that both of us still have things we want to do. Just won't be doing them in Congress after this year. But thank you again. And I want to thank you and Ranking Member Upton for holding this hearing. As some recent high-profile events have proven, disruption to our energy supplies has some dire consequences. And the need for reliability is only going to increase as we see more extreme weather events and the proliferation of cyber attacks. The reliable delivery of energy, whether it's gas, oil, or electricity, is absolutely critical. And so I'm glad this committee is having this hearing on legislation that would finally bring standards to the sector and ensure that consumers will have power when they need it. Chairman Glick, Pennsylvania is second only to Texas in domestic natural gas production. But the reliability issues that might happen in Texas, such as failure to account for cold weather in the winter, may not arise in other regions. Do you think that oil and gas reliability standards should vary depending on a region's geography and climate? And would FERC be likely to take those factors into account in approving standards proposed by the Energy Product Reliability Organization that the Act would create?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Doyle. So the standards themselves, as you pointed out, would under the legislation would be set by the EPRO, and the EPRO would essentially recommend whether the standards should be applied internationally, or they apply to certain sections of the country, depending on various factors, as you point out, weather being one of them. That's the similar thing happens on the electric side, where sometimes standards are different, depending on where the utility is located and what the particular issue is. So I think that the legislation would provide, is currently drafted, I believe the legislation would provide flexibility to the EPRO to provide that type of flexibility to different people around the country, depending on their circumstances.
Yeah, I think that'd be important. Deputy Secretary Turk, this Department of Energy has been on the front lines combating cyber threats against our energy infrastructure. Can you tell us what type of cybersecurity threats pose the greatest risk to the reliability of our energy infrastructure? And where are those threats mostly coming from? Are the threats posed to the electric industry different than the threats posed to our natural gas and oil infrastructure?
Well, the honest answer, we've got threats across the board. We've got threats from criminals, the ransomware and other things that we've seen, including in the Colonial Pipeline situation. And then we have threats coming from governments as well, very sophisticated threats. And it's not just electricity, it's not just pipelines, it's refineries, it's across the electricity and across the energy spectrum. So we need to be prepared for all of that. And just to answer your previous question to Chairman Glick, we certainly completely agree. We need to have mandatory standards. We need to have minimum standards working hand in hand with the private sector. We need to update those standards. And it's good for those standards to be national, just as you said, so that whether it's pipelines or other infrastructure in one state has a similar regime and similarly protected. But we've really got to continue to work on these issues. We've got no time to waste.
Well, let me ask you, while TSA is theoretically responsible for setting cybersecurity standards for pipelines, 2 GAO reports have pointed out how inept they've been in this regard. Can you elaborate on how the new EPRO would finally put energy experts in charge of creating enforceable reliability standards?
Mr. Doyle, if I may, this is Chairman Glick. I think that the EPRO would, in several ways, differ from TSA's current authority. First of all, TSA has authority over cybersecurity and physical security of pipelines, but not other reliability standards, impacts on weather, other issues that impact the reliability of pipelines. Secondly, as I understand, the TSA standards that were released only last for a year. And the EPRO would be able to propose, and FERC would essentially approve standards that would be more long-lasting, that would be permanent standards that could be modified over time. And I think it's very important to have a standard-setting situation where you don't just have to come back every year and renew those standards, that you'd have some sort of certainty for pipeline companies and others to make the investments they need to make to comply with longer-lasting standards.
Thanks for that clarification. Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired, and I will yield back.
When you're back, the chair now recognizes Mr. Lana for 5 minutes questioning.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for our witnesses for being with us today. And also, I'd like to just congratulate you for all your years of service here in the House of Representatives and also to this committee. I want to wish you all the best in your years ahead. Late last year, as we were approaching the beginning of winter and home heating oil costs were surging to 7-year highs, the Biden administration was considering shutting down a critically important pipeline that delivers fuel to the Midwest. And I know my good friend from Michigan has already touched on this. In response, I led a letter with several of my colleagues to President Biden expressing our concerns that revoking the permit for Line 5 would eliminate tens of thousands of jobs, jeopardize billions of dollars in economic activity, and exasperate fuel shortages and price hikes across the Midwest. It appears the President read our letter because several days after receiving it, his White House backed down the idea that they were going to intervene and shut down the pipeline. However, Michigan Governor Whitmer continues to play politics and trying to shut down the pipeline, and the Biden administration is still in consultations with the Canadian government over the pipeline's fate. That's why I also joined my colleagues, the gentlemen from Michigan, Meschers, Wahlberg, and Bergman, to introduce the Pipes Act, which prohibits sole executive authority for revoking permits for the construction or operation of cross-border energy infrastructure facilities. If I could start with the Deputy Secretary, Mr. Turk, and again, in keeping with the great traditions of this committee with our chairman, former Chairman Dingell, whose room you aptly named after, I'm going to ask you a series of yes or no questions. Are you aware that PHMSA determined there is no unsafe or hazardous conditions that would warrant shutdown of Line 5?
I'm not personally aware of that. Again, other agencies have the jurisdiction on that, so it's not an issue I've spent a lot of time on.
All right, because I know I sent a letter to PHMSA in late 2020 asking for them to confirm this. Yes or no, based on safety data from DOE and DOT, isn't it true that pipelines rather than rail and trucking are considered to be the safest and most efficient method for transporting energy products?
So as a general rule, there are some positive safety benefits from pipelines over trucking or other ways to bring in, especially when you're talking significant volumes.
Okay, yes or no, has DOA conducted an analysis of the energy security and energy price impacts that would result from the shutdown of Line 5?
Again, I've not personally spent time on that, so I can't speak what analysis has been done or not on that. We can certainly get that back to you on the record.
Is DOE consulting with the White House or the state of Michigan on a potential Line 5 closure?
I've not personally consulted on that issue. We've got a full range of other issues I've been focused on.
Okay, who would be the one to be being consulted on that?
So we can certainly have a follow-up discussion and have an answer for the record. And
Yeah,
certainly
we
happy
really need to
talk
get that because,
further
again,
on
as
that.
I mentioned earlier, we're talking about billions of dollars and tens of thousands of jobs that could impact Ohio and Michigan. You know, you mentioned earlier about, in your testimony also about cybersecurity. Just by coincidence, today's Wall Street Journal, we got risking Cybergeddon and about a coordinated attack could shut down 80% of U.S. electrical grid. And so, you know, we've been talking a lot about cyber in this committee and how important it is. Last year, 2 bills that I co-led with my good friend, ENC member, the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, were signed into law as part of the infrastructure bill to help boost grid security and resilience by encouraging coordination between DOE and electric utilities. Will you commit to quickly implementing these 2 bills, the CyberSense Act and enhancing grid security through public-private partnerships, given the pressing threat posed to the grid by cyber attacks?
So as I've said, we absolutely have to, and I completely agree with you, Congressman, we absolutely have to do more on cybersecurity. And the president has said so, my secretary has said so, our chairman of our FERC has said so, and eager to work hand in hand with you on any piece of legislation, and certainly we can provide our technical expertise and advice on what we think makes the most sense.
Well, thank you. Let me ask this, in a follow-up from maybe a question a little bit earlier, is an LNG export ban being considered by the administration?
So again, our statutory authority, and FERC has another statutory authority, is looking at the national interest. And we need to look at affordability, we need to look
Okay,
at security, and we
but
need
so
to look at
the question though
CO2 footprint side of
is it
things.
being considered yes or no?
So we're looking at the full range of what you
So
all
you're
have
saying
given
that
us to
you
look
could,
at.
so if I can interpret what you're saying yes.
So we're doing this analysis more
Okay,
broadly.
thank you very much. Do you agree that it is the United States' interest to provide natural gas to our allies and trading partners to reduce their energy dependence on dangerous regimes?
So again, there is a very significant energy security benefit from our LNG going to Europe, to Japan, elsewhere. And in the national interest, we need to look at the energy security piece. We need to look at the affordability to U.S. consumers. And we need to look at the environmental sustainability and the CO2 footprint as well. So we need to look at all of that. But certainly there are energy security benefits.
Okay, but again, I'm trying to get a yes or no here, because again, you know, especially what we're seeing happening right now in Russia and Ukraine, and making sure, because I was with then chairman, that,
Gentleman's time,
I guess my time's expired, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California who's also announced his retirement. And the chair want to personally thank the gentleman for the many times he's assumed the gavel in the chairman's absence. The chair now recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chair and the two witnesses, and especially Mr. Rush for your friendship and working together, and all your leadership in the issues that we're discussing today. I've been working for years to improve the reliability of our energy systems, especially by addressing the cyber vulnerabilities, including the 2 bills to improve grid cybersecurity with Mr. Latta that he just referred to. These were included in the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act just signed into law last year. Deputy Secretary Turk, I'm concerned, however, that not as much attention has been devoted to pipeline cybersecurity as has been devoted to grid cybersecurity, and that the lack of a central agency with energy expertise overseeing pipeline cybersecurity creates confusions, which in turn reduces security. Since the establishment of the CSER office at DOE in 2018, how has the DOE built up its internal expertise and capacity to address and advise on cyber threats?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman, not only for the question, but for your years and years of focusing on the cybersecurity side of things. And I have to say, ahead of the curve in many, many ways. So this is a top priority for DOE, and we've made the investments. You mentioned the CSER office, a terrific group of colleagues, Piyush Kumar, who's the head of that office, but a terrific group of colleagues. And we focus on everything from leveraging our expertise, including our national labs, on cutting-edge technology that can be helpful on the cybersecurity side. We coordinate with the energy sector, not just the electricity sector, but the oil and gas sector on our coordinating councils. We work on testing, including on our Citrix system, to try to test and make sure that we can bring that expertise for the private sector, and make sure that we've got ability to have information sharing from the public and private sector. Our CRISP program in particular has been incredibly important along those lines. And we've got what I think is a very robust regime on bulk power, and that's the FERC-NERC model that I think has worked quite well. And we absolutely need to have mandatory standards on pipelines, but it goes beyond pipelines to refineries and throughout the supply chain on the oil and gas side of things as well. And we really need to bolster that.
Thank you for that pretty comprehensive answer, pretty briefly. Do you see a significant role for artificial intelligence in the development and implementation of pipeline cybersecurity?
So we focused on artificial intelligence, machine learning, making sure we're using all our advanced computing capabilities, and we've got phenomenal advanced computing capabilities in our national labs in particular. And there's absolutely a role that it can play on pipeline safety in addition to a number of other areas. And certainly we need to make sure if we're bringing artificial intelligence to bear, we've got to have good cyber security protections there to make sure that that kind of technology is not hacked into in ways that are detrimental. But we should use all the tools we have on the reliability front.
Thank you. Chairman Glick, many cities in California are working to reduce their reliance on natural gas to meet state climate goals and to move away from price volatility and intermittency exacerbated by climate change. That was demonstrated last year in Texas's winter storm. Does climate change and the associated extreme weather events pose a risk to the reliable delivery of energy products like oil and natural gas? Please answer with a yes or no.
Yes, it does, Congressman.
I'll take the promotion,
Give you a
maybe.
promotion.
Anyway, has NERC, which serves a function similar to the proposed energy product reliability organization, responded to increasing climate threats and setting standards for the bulk power systems? Have they done enough?
So Congressman McNerney, I appreciate the question. So I think the standards that have been set at the electric level, I think, have generally been pretty good. But I wanted to point out an example where I think we failed a bit, and that is going back to the Texas situation, in the sense that there was a similar cold weather event back in 2011, and there was a similar report done. The report recommended that there be standards for weatherizing generation facilities. And unfortunately, that recommendation got watered down into some sort of guidance. And the guidance wasn't essentially followed because, generation is a very competitive business, and some electric generators didn't want to make the investments if their competitors weren't going to make the investments. So I do think that's where it's a good example where mandatory standards are absolutely necessary, essentially to require everyone to engage in that, those type of investments. If we had done that back in 2011, we probably wouldn't have had the disaster that occurred last February in Texas.
So national mandatory standards, I take it. But thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, yield back. The chairman now recognizes my dear friend from the great state of West Virginia, and I emphasize my dear friend, Mr. McKinley, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And congratulations to both you and Paulette coming through. You defeated COVID over the holidays. But as for your decision not to return next year, your voice and your passion for so many people across America is going to be sorely missed.
I shared it with you.
But Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, however,
There we go.
this bill may be well-intended, but the committee should be addressing the rising energy costs of today. According to the EIA, heating bills could increase as much as 54% this winter. And in the Build Back Better plan, Democrats wanted to add a tax on natural gas. The American Gas Association estimates that would raise household energy costs by an additional 17% on top of it. So fortunately, this bill is dying in the Senate. Mr. Chairman, is your party tone deaf? The people across America are struggling. According to Help Advisor, last year, more than 1 in 4 Americans said they went without basic needs to pay their energy bill. Why isn't this committee considering ways to lower the cost of energy bills? But this bill fails to address that. And the White House relentlessly continues this wage of war on pipeline development. Just look at the Environmental Justice Report on page 59. It specifically says it recommends no new pipelines in America. They already want to shut down the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, Line 5, we've already talked about those today, and all while supporting Russia's Nord Stream 2. Let's put this in perspective, Mr. Chairman. Last year, with a new president and your party in the majority, the committee held only 74 hearings and markups, most of which were to add more regulations. Contrast that with 2017, when President Trump's first year in office and when Republicans were in the majority. This committee held 106 hearings and markups. That's nearly 50% more. And our focus was primarily on transparency and streamlining permitting and removing barriers for job creation. With that decrease in hearings, it's no wonder that the public doesn't trust Congress. And their polls will indicate we're headed in the wrong direction. 2 in 3 people say we're headed in the wrong direction. To rebuild that trust, and we should be working to reduce energy costs, not add to it. So Chairman Glick, the Natural Gas Act requires FERC to conduct a public interest review before a pipeline project can move forward. with a yes or no, do you believe it's in the public interest to have access to reliable and affordable supplies of natural gas? It's a yes or no.
Yes.
Thank you. But now FERC wants to redefine public interest to include climate change and the social cost of carbon, which will hinder pipeline development. Because of that, the pipeline restrictions, New England currently now imports its natural gas from countries like Russia because of pipeline restriction. And we know the Russian gas is 40% dirtier than our American gas. Can you just define to me, why is this in our public interest to import gas from Russia rather than use American gas? It also is more affordable?
Thanks for the question, Mr. McKinley. I wouldn't say I disagree with the premise of the question. The commission isn't forcing greenhouse gas emissions regulation on pipeline development or pipeline considerations. We're required to under both the law and by the courts. And my point is that the courts have repeatedly told us over the last several years that if we don't engage in that type of analysis to determine what the impact of a proposed pipeline might be on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, the courts send the cases back to us. And that's the problem. We end up creating more uncertainty, more delay, and less gas production.
If I could, Mr. Glick, do you think it sends a message of trust to the American people when they see a tanker coming from Russia to provide gas to New England? Is that how we rebuild trust? We rely on foreign nations to bring this thing in?
I think the gas situation in New England is complicated, but in large part it's due to the fact that there hasn't been enough demand to bring in new pipeline development. But I want to point out, not that it's much better, but the natural gas that's supplied by LNG into New England is primarily from Africa and not from Russia.
Mr. Chairman, I've run out of time, so I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the esteemed chairman of the subcommittee on environment, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tucker, for 5 minutes. Mr. Tucker is recognized. Mr. Tucker is not. Mr. Tucker is recognized. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, for 5 minutes. Note here, Mr. Vesey. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mr. Johnson from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's a bit ironic that today we're now finally having a hearing on protecting our nation's pipeline infrastructure, because my Democrat colleagues have spent over a year now conducting an all-out assault on reliable and affordable fossil fuels and the infrastructure needed to transport these vital resources to market. But this hypocrisy is nothing new. Let me take you back to May of 2021. The Colonial Pipeline, which supplies nearly half the fuel consumed on the East Coast. As we all remember, it suffered a major cyber attack. And Secretary Granholm, from the White House podium, admitted that when it comes to moving America's fuel, she said, and I quote, "pipe is the best way to go." Mr. Turk, do you agree with Secretary Granholm? Is pipe the best way to go?
So thank you, Congressman, for the question. As I referenced earlier.
No, it's a yes or no answer, Mr. Turk. Do you agree with Secretary Granholm? Don't need an elaboration, it's a yes or no.
So yes, there are
Okay, thank you.
safety.
All right then,
other
well,
benefits.
I don't know about you, Mr. Deputy Secretary, but I do agree that pipe is the best way to go. With the litany of anti-pipeline actions from this administration, it makes you wonder who's really responsible for American energy security, because President Biden sure isn't listening to his energy secretary or to people like you, Mr. Turk, that think pipe is also the best way to go. I mean, we all know about the administration's actions against the Keystone XL pipeline and then Enbridge 5 line, which provides energy to Michigan and my home state of Ohio, considering shutting that down. But here's another one. Have any of you heard of the Penn East pipeline? $1 billion pipeline to carry reliable, affordable natural gas from Appalachia to New Jersey. Our full committee chairman's home state, by the way. Last fall, it was canceled due to massive opposition from environmentalists and radical left-wing state politicians. I wonder, do my Democrat colleagues really want to secure our pipelines? Or do they want to just side with the radical environmentalists and shut down the pipelines in favor of weather-dependent renewable energy sources? It seems to me that many of our Democratic friends can't seem to make up their minds. So, Mr. Turk, you were previously the Deputy Director of the International Energy Agency. A recent report was published by that agency that stated we need to move an energy economy, quote, we need to move to an energy economy, and I quote, dominated by renewables like solar and wind instead of fossil fuels. Do you agree with that we should move to an energy economy dominated by renewables like solar and wind instead of fossil fuels?
So I think we need to do two things simultaneously. Given the climate imperative, and we're already seeing the risks and damages to climate across our country.
I don't want to debate climate change, Mr.
Well,
Turk. I ask you a simple question. Do you agree with that agency's statement that we should move to an energy economy dominated by renewables like wind and solar?
Because of these climate impacts, we need to move very aggressively in a diverse way with a variety of clean energy resources.
So you
whether it's
agree,
wind,
you
solar,
agree with
hydrogen.
Secretary Granholm that we should protect what we have and diversify, right?
Well, that's the second part of the answer I was going to say. As we move to this diverse, robust, clean energy future, we need to make sure existing energy is reliable, secure.
But how do we
American
make sure that the energy is reliable and secure when the efforts to shut down the very pipelines that take that energy to market are being throttled? How do we do that? How do you account for the administration's protection of where we are today? Because that's not happening.
So just to be clear, the challenges we're seeing across the country on affordability right now, whether it's on the oil side or the natural gas side, are largely stemming from the pandemic and supply and demand being out of whack.
I mean, these pipelines, some of these pipelines have been running since 1953. The consideration to close down the Enbridge 5, since 1953 it's been running. The XL pipeline has been in construction for years, had nothing to do with the pandemic.
But that's not the issue that's causing the current affordability challenges we're seeing across the country. Right now, we do not have enough supply matching up with the demand as our economy is roaring back, and the U.S. economy is doing quite well right now. And we don't have enough supply on the oil side to match up to that. That's why we're doing the kinds of things we're doing with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try to bridge that time period as our domestic producers get more and more product on the market.
Mr. Chairman, we should be doing everything we can to increase production and use of our own resources here in America, and that's not what this administration is doing. That's what would bring down the price of gas at the pumps and lower the cost of groceries on the shelves. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Schreier, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your years of service to this country. And thank you to both of our experts for being here for today's discussion about how we can safeguard our energy systems from a whole gamut of threats, everything from weather to cyber terrorism. I have 2 questions, one for each of you, and I'll direct the first to Deputy Secretary Turk. As you know, hydropower is a reliable and inexpensive form of clean energy, and my state, Washington, is the hydro capital of the country. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided a much-needed investment in our hydro industry, and I was therefore really proud to support that legislation. Now, with the impacts of climate change and droughts occurring in Western states in the past year, at least one hydro generation facility was actually taken offline. So greater investments in our facilities to increase resiliency is critical toward ensuring that we can continue to rely on hydropower as we transition to clean and renewable sources. What additional measures is the administration taking to address these challenges and potential years of lower flow to make sure we can still rely on hydropower?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for the question and your focus, rightfully so, in my opinion, on hydropower. It's such an incredibly important part of our clean energy generation currently, and we feel that hydropower needs to play an even more important role going forward. And so whether it's the funding provided in the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, and thank you for your leadership on that and others, or all the other efforts we're doing on hydropower to make sure we retain the existing hydropower that we have, look at additional ways to bring additional hydropower generation where it makes sense throughout, and using hydro for storage and to balance with other renewables like solar and wind as well. So we're spending an awful lot of time and attention rightfully on hydropower, and we also need to, just as you said, take into account climate change's impact on snowpack and other hydro resources and make sure we're prepared to deal with that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for also mentioning pumped hydro as a great method of storing energy. And I think that Representative McMorris-Rodgers and I agree that adding power generation to dams that are already in existence is another way to increase our use. Chairman Glick, when extreme weather causes gas production to drop, as it did again in Texas 3 weeks ago, generators are left scrambling at the last moment to find alternative sources of supply, often passing the costs on to ratepayers. My question is whether you agree that electric generators would benefit from increased visibility into gas market conditions, where it is, where they can get it, and whether Chairman Rush's proposed legislation could help ameliorate what's a significant vulnerability in our current gas supply system.
Thank you for the question, Ms. Schreier. Certainly increased transparency in the natural gas market would certainly benefit electric generators, would benefit consumers, would benefit a lot of folks, just to have a better sense of what's going on out there in the market. And as you mentioned, sometimes electric generators are forced to go out there and scramble for fuel supply when fuel supply gets tight. So it certainly would have significant advantages to the extent there's better transparency. I don't believe that the legislation before us, which is primarily focused on reliability and ensuring that pipeline companies are more reliable, would provide much in terms of transparency. But I would say that to the extent that we ensure that these pipeline systems are more reliable, especially on the natural gas pipeline system, electric generators will be more confident that they will be able to access the fuel that they need to keep the electric generation going during times of extreme weather.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. And then lastly, our system in Washington State, we depend on the Canadian natural gas supply chain. How do you see international connections being included in sharing gas market conditions, but also in these measures for cybersecurity?
So Ms. Schreier, I can compare it to our electricity standards. So our electricity reliability standard process is set by NERC, which not only operates in the United States, but also in Canada and a small part of Mexico that's connected to the rest of the electric grid. And so the standards that are applied there have to go through review by the Canadian government, for instance, but they're similar in most cases, the same exact standards that apply here in the United States. And there's a provision in the bill before us, HR 6084, which says that this electric, the EPRO, the Pipeline Reliability Organization, would have to try to make efforts to get similar notification or recognition in Canada as well as the United States.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Charlie, yes, ma'am. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to have two administration witnesses here today amid surging energy prices that are eating into families' budgets across the country. It's important that this committee exercise oversight into the policies that are sacrificing our energy security and affordability. I am disappointed that the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee has not been allowed to hold a single hearing to examine how the administration's policies may have played a role in the energy crisis. In fact, the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee hasn't been allowed to hold a hearing from September 29th of last year until tomorrow's hearing on cleaning up cryptocurrency. The energy impacts of blockchain. Okay, shifting gears. Deputy Secretary Turk, in your written testimony, you mentioned devastating impacts of disruption through multiple events. You cite cyber threats, important. Supply chain risks in critical hardware, important, and in software, important. You mention incidents like the February 2021 winter storms and the May 2021 Colonial Pipeline incident. In testimony here today, we've heard about hydropower just now and climate impacts and how they should be looked at and so forth, and that's important. Have you had numerous briefings with other federal agencies and industry on these issues as you imply on page 1 of your written statement, yes or no?
Yes, absolutely.
And can you give me an estimate of how many such briefings have occurred? 5, 10, dozens?
So myself, I spend time on these issues on a daily basis with interagency colleagues, with industry colleagues. I don't know what number with other colleagues at DOE, it's
So
probably
dozens.
hourly.
Yeah, so dozens with other agencies, states, and industry.
Well, absolutely, focused on affordability, focused on reliability, all the issues that you referenced.
How many briefings have you participated in with other federal agencies, states, or industry on cleaning up cryptocurrency, the energy impacts of blockchain? We couldn't get an answer this morning from your agency.
So that's an issue I've personally spent some time on, including when I worked at the International Energy Agency.
Yeah.
And looking not only at the impact of blockchain and digital impacts today, but looking it into the future. And I know folks at the Department
But
of
it
Energy,
would be
including our national
fair,
labs.
yeah, but it would be fair to say that you focused more on the issues that you put in your written statement and what you've talked about here today, such as cybersecurity. Wouldn't that be fair that you focus more on cybersecurity and problems with the supply chains and the issues that you've put in your written statement that you've testified to previously today? Wouldn't that be a fair statement? Yes or no?
So it's a big
Yes or
diverse
no?
agency. We work on all of these things. Personally, I've probably spent more time on cyber security, more time on affordability.
Have
than
you
I've spent on cyber.
have you talked about those issues in the last 4 months? And you spend more time on cybersecurity and so forth. Have you talked about those issues in the last 4 months?
So I have. It's an issue that we're focused on.
Yeah. So, from the actions that you've told me about, and I appreciate that, it seems to me that perhaps, just maybe, the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce ought to be focusing on some other issues that are more pressing than the energy use of cybersecurity, energy issues related to cryptocurrency. In energy, we've heard today about Line 5. Mr. Johnson just brought up another one. We've heard about hydro. Members are bringing up all kinds of issues, the causes for the cost increases. You were about to get into a debate on that with Mr. Johnson. That's all fine. But the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, which has not met for almost 4 months, also has jurisdiction over healthcare. So issues like nursing shortages, broadband, the internet, manufacturing, and of course, not only for energy, but for all kinds of sectors, including why does the House have masks made from China when we could get those made in the United States of America? That this is what the House provided us. Maybe that's what oversight and investigations ought to be doing. I know you can't answer that question, Mr. Turk, but I greatly appreciate you being here today. These are important issues, but I think that the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee ought to be freed and ought to be able to find its own course. And sometimes I will agree with the chairwoman and sometimes I won't, but that's an important subcommittee that is not being used currently by leadership. It's a shame and it's a waste. I want to talk about, and I'll probably send you some questions later, about parity between fossil fuels and renewables, because I think it's important as we see China and India both increasing substantially their, and the European Union substantially increasing their use of coal. We need to find new technologies to make it better. We can do it. This is the United States of America. We can make it happen. I appreciate your time, and I yield back.
A number of years back, the chair of the oversight committee is on the screen, but now the chair does recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tucker, the chairman of the committee, subcommittee on environment, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your great work as Subcommittee Chair on Energy. So, Chairman Glick, welcome. I know you and FERC must frequently consider the boundaries between federal and state responsibilities in our energy system. And I'm assuming that the proposed Energy Product Reliability Organization in Chairman Rush's bill would require significant federal-state coordination. So can you give us some insight to how we should think about these jurisdictional divides?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Tonko. I think there are, again, I want to point to a good example, which is, again, the way we handle electricity reliability, the way the legislation from the Energy Policy Act of 2005 addressed the issue is they gave FERC and NERC the authority over the reliability of the bulk power system, the long-distance transmission lines, the big generation facilities and so on. And it gave the states jurisdiction over or essentially it left to the states jurisdiction over the reliability of the distribution system. And I think that's the way we're going to have to think about that on a going forward basis. The states have a significant role to play with regard to the LDCs, the local distribution companies that provide natural gas to homes and businesses and so on, and factories. And I think if they need to play a very significant role in ensuring that those pipelines, the pipelines that get to the end of the system, so to speak, that those are also reliable. And so I think they're going to. It's an issue that FERC and the states need to coordinate on, just like we do on electricity reliability.
And basically the responsibilities of the federal government or perhaps this NERC-like organization?
So I think the responsibility of the federal government, the way the legislation is currently drafted, HR 6084, it doesn't make a distinction between the local distribution and essentially the interstate grid of natural gas pipelines. It's something that I would recommend that the committee take a look at as it proceeds in the legislative process.
Thank you. And if NERC partially serves as a model for this proposal, how has NERC been able to overcome some of the federal-state coordination and jurisdictional issues that exist in the electricity system?
Well, I think NERC works very closely with a series of regional reliability organizations that are spread out throughout the country that are more focused on some of the local reliability issues. And I think NERC also plays a very big role in coordinating with NARUC, which is the Association of State Utility Commissions, and the individual state commissions as well. I know in fact, they spend a lot of time talking with them, making sure their jurisdictions, that they're working together on the same issues.
Thank you. And even with this legislation, do you believe there will still be an important role for energy security planning and emergency preparedness by the states?
Absolutely. We mentioned earlier there's 3 million miles of pipes around the country, and I think the federal government, through this process established by this legislation, will address some of the bigger issues. But I think that a lot of the local level issues are issues that are already within the jurisdiction of state utility commissions, such as ensuring that the local pipelines are operating reliably, that are providing reliable gas service to homes, for instance, for heating and so on.
Thank you. And Secretary Turk, welcome. The department's cybersecurity efforts have required significant public-private coordination, but is there anything you can tell us about the need to improve coordination between federal and state partners on these reliability and cyber issues?
I think, Congressman, it's an excellent question and right to focus on those issues of coordination, public, private, and federal and state and local as well. And we spend an awful lot of time, our CSER team in particular, working hand in hand with FERC, working hand in hand with others in the interagency, but working hand in hand with state and locals and make sure that we've got a full plan in place to provide the reliability and the cybersecurity. Everyone needs to be on board here.
Right, thank you. And Secretary, I want to commend DOE for the Building a Better Grid initiative. This focus on our nation's transmission system is critical to achieving reliable, resilient, and clean electricity across the country. But if our modern and reliable transmission system is very dependent on generation that may have unreliable delivery infrastructure, the whole system could crumble. So how do you see pipeline reliability and cybersecurity standards complementing the department's broader goals of building a more modern and resilient electricity system?
So first of all, let me thank you, Congressman, and others who supported the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, which gave us $16 billion at the Department of Energy to work further on electricity resilience. That is a historic level of funding and support that we plan on using very effectively to promote the reliability, the security, the resilience more generally. Electricity is certainly tied hand in hand with natural gas and with other parts of the energy system. And we need to be thinking of cybersecurity and reliability and resilience all together and throughout the value chains and throughout multiple value chains as well. So just as the FERC and NERC model has worked well for electricity, we need to have mandatory standards from the Department of Energy perspective for other parts of our energy spectrum. Thank you to TSA for stepping up and having some mandatory standards put in place for pipelines. But we also think other parts of that value chain need standards, need federal standards, national standards, including refineries and other parts of that value chain as well. Again, having a coherent system in place so that we can do what we need to do.
Thank you so much. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Bouchard, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to say thank you for your service to your country. And in your retirement, I hope you continue to promote the policies and the things that you have been doing on behalf of your constituents in the Chicagoland area. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Turk and Chairman Glick, for being here today. Well, here we are in 2022, and Americans around the country are still facing the consequences of the dreadful state of American energy under this administration. This month, my constituents in Indiana are paying gas prices that are nearly 40% higher than last year. Winter is underway, and Hoosiers are having to devote more of their paychecks to pay their energy bills and forgo other basic household necessities like food and medicine. Stunning levels of inflation that have hampered the American economy for the last several months and are ongoing and are not short-term are causing and exacerbating the effects of these high energy prices. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has not effectively addressed this fundamental problem impacting millions of Americans. This committee should be conducting oversight of the administration and working with the Department of Energy to address this inflation and rising fuel prices. However, as evidenced by the bill we're discussing today, the majority appears to be more interested in finding ways to expand the federal government's regulatory footprint in the U.S. energy sector rather than resolving key problems impacting ordinary Americans. Therefore, I'm disappointed that the rising energy costs and inflation are not the central topic of today's hearing. Deputy Secretary Turk, I just have one question, what's a little out of the direction I was headed here, but I'd like to know, as it relates to LNG and crude oil exports, yes or no, is an export ban on the table as a way to, unfortunately, won't address energy costs here, but I guess the administration thinks maybe it will?
So an export ban, either on the LNG side or on the oil side, is not something we're currently discussing and under consideration.
Great, thank you for that answer. I'm concerned about the administration's mismanagement of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, in my view, in response to energy prices. The SPR is intended as a safeguard to protect U.S. energy from the effects of a natural disaster or other major disruptions in the energy market, not as a tool to influence domestic fuel prices. Going back to the Obama administration, we directed DOE to conduct a long-term strategic review of the SPR. We also authorized a series of drawdowns to, quote-unquote, right-size the SPR and provide funding for a life extension and modernization program. Deputy Secretary Turk, I'm concerned the administration is attempting to circumvent Congress and the statutory limitations under the Energy Policy and Conservation Act designed to protect the SPR from political manipulation. Yes or no, by law, the President must make an emergency declaration to determine that a severe energy supply interruption exists before authorizing an SPR drawdown. Is that correct?
So there are a number of ways we can use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And in the case of the 50 million barrels that was announced and we're deploying right now, there was not an emergency designation. That was not one of the authorities that we used. For the 50 million barrels, what we did, 18 million barrels of that was a congressionally mandated sale that we moved up the timing of that, all perfectly consistent with congressional authorization. And then the other 32 million barrels was done what's called an exchange. And we use that mechanism for the particular moment in time because our economy is heated up, but our supply of oil has not matched that. That's why we have the pressures, and that's why the price has gone up, including what consumers pay at the pump.
So
And
why
so
didn't?
this tool is meant to be particularly suited for this backwardation we currently have in the market in order to round that off and to make sure we get more product into the market now when consumers need those that price reduction.
Fair enough. I mean, I think he did it before Thanksgiving because his polling numbers were down and the American people were mad that their energy prices were going up. And honestly, based on your answer, 99.9% of the American people wouldn't be able to decipher the reason why he did it. So why didn't he make a finding of a severe energy interruption? Is it because other International Energy Agency members in Europe refused to authorize a collective drawdown of their reserves?
So we spent months and months looking at the available tools that we had on this, and we came forward with what I think is an incredibly well put together plan for the particular moment in time that we faced. And we have a significant backwardation in the market. We do so again now that the prices have gone back up. When that supply from the US, from Canada, from Brazil, and from some other countries in OPEC Plus match up with that demand, the prices will go down. That's what our EIA experts and others are predicting in 2022. But we have a peak of the curve, if you want to think about it this way. And the exchange mechanism in particular helps shave that peak off, protecting consumers and promoting more supply.
Fair enough. I mean, I think it was used to get around Congress, personally. But fair enough. I yield back.
Some years back, the chair now recognizes the very capable and effective chairman of the subcommittee on oversight and investigation, Ms. Neguet, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to pile on my thanks for your years of service to this committee and the Congress, and also your years of personal friendship to me. It means a lot. I also want to thank the ranking member of the Oversight Subcommittee for already preparing in advance for our wonderful hearing on energy use and cyber security and cyber issues tomorrow. And I also want to say that I would have a hearing in oversight and investigation every week. Under the pandemic, only one of our 2 committee rooms is wired for the ability to do WebEx and in person at the same time. And I've been asking the chairman if we could get both of our committee hearing rooms up and running so that we can have a robust number of hearings. But I just want to say, Mr. Griffith, and all of the rest of my Democratic and Republican members of Oversight and Investigation, get ready for a very robust year, starting with our cyber currency hearing tomorrow. I want to ask, I have a number of questions, but Chairman Glick, I want to ask you, several of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have unfortunately implied that it's the administration's policy to get natural gas from China and Russia. I'd like you to, if you can, talk just for a brief moment about what the administration's policy is in terms of importing natural gas from foreign sources.
Thank you for the question, Ms. Neguet. So FERC is an independent agency, and so I can't speak for what the administration's position is or not. I will say that the commission has, over a number of years, approved a large number of proposed LNG export facilities. And our job is to make sure that the facilities are essentially operated safely, and that when they're constructed, that they're constructed safely and they don't have an adverse impact on the environment. And so I think we've seen the demand. The companies are coming in asking for...
Sir, you're not answering my question, so I'm going to move on because I have some other questions. I want to ask you, during Storm Uri, many utilities and independent power producers, including those in Colorado, were forced to pay exorbitant natural gas prices on the spot market because natural gas suppliers did not fulfill their firm contracts. So I want to ask you how Chairman Rush's legislation can protect ratepayers from similar costs in the future.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Gannon. It's a great question because that's exactly, I think that's the reason, one of the reasons we're here today. We're talking about energy prices. We need to also talk about what happens in energy prices when pipelines are no longer reliable. And we saw what happened with regard to the natural gas system in Texas. Not only did that bring down electricity, and it obviously caused blackouts, caused enormous amounts of costs for consumers, it also raised natural gas prices in the entire region. And consumers in Colorado, consumers in Kansas, consumers in Oklahoma and elsewhere had to pay for that, and they're still paying for that, exorbitant rates, in large part because the supply and demand system was out of whack. There wasn't enough natural gas to go around. And so I think that's one of the benefits of this legislation. We promote a more reliable natural gas system. Not only will you reduce cost on the electric grid, you also reduce cost on the natural gas, for natural gas consumers as well.
Thank you. Now, you identified in your testimony 4 features of Chairman Rush's bill that help address the risks posed by our current lack of gas reliability standards. And one of those features is the Commission's ability to issue emergency energy production reliability standards if warranted. Now, can you tell us why you think that authority is essential? And do you think the Federal Power Act should be amended to give the Commission the ability to issue emergency electric reliability standards?
I do believe so. The current approach on the electric reliability side isn't always nimble enough to address emergencies. And the Department of Energy has certainly emergency authority under certain circumstances. But I think FERC should actually have the authority both on the electric side and the natural gas side to actually propose and actually implement emergency reliability standards when those conditions warrant.
Okay, that's great. Deputy Secretary Turk, now I understand that the Transportation Security Administration and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency recently issued 3 directives aimed at owners and operators of TSA pipelines. And so I'm wondering if was the Department of Energy involved in those standards and in any determinations? And briefly, can you tell me what factors were considered in those designations?
Thank you. We work hand in hand and provide our expertise to our full interagency partners, including TSA and CISA as well. And we were very pleased that there are now mandatory standards on the books for pipelines that TSA has put out. As Chairman Glick has said, though, that is a 1-year emergency designation. We are going to have cybersecurity issues for more than a year, and we need to have that longer-term piece. And we also need to have standards, from our opinion, on refinery and other parts of the value chain as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both of our panelists. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your service.
Yes, man. Now recognizes Mr. Walmart for 5 minutes. Mr. Walmart, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I wish you all the best. You've got a year left to work here. We're glad we'll have the chance to work with you and look forward to seeing you here. However, as you know, I was born and spent the first 6 years of my life in your district, so I can find you. I know where you're at.
I'm not hurting you.
To review, on his first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order revoking the cross-border permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. The Keystone XL pipeline would have created tens of thousands of jobs and ensured a stable supply of nearly 800,000 barrels per day of crude oil from our closest ally and trading partner, Canada, my neighbor. If President Biden had not revoked the permit, the Keystone pipeline would allow the U.S. to produce more gasoline and diesel, which would help us reduce imports from the Middle East and Russia and Africa. Unbelievably, especially in light of the fact that Secretary Granholm is a former governor of Michigan, the administration is also considering closing down Michigan's Line 5 pipeline, which delivers the majority of Michigan and the region's propane and other essential fuels for heating, agriculture, and manufacturing. Political whims should not decide whether Michiganders can heat their homes or not. So I've introduced the Protecting International Pipelines for Energy Security, PIPES Act, which would prevent President Biden from punitively shutting down existing energy pipelines like Line 5 without congressional approval. Deputy Secretary Turk, welcome. Thank you for being here. Do you support the construction of pipelines from Canada to increase the domestic supply of oil and refined products? Yes or no?
So just to be clear on Line 5, we don't have the authority on that front. And,
We'll talk about that later. I've heard that statement, and I have some concerns with that. But yes or no, do you support construction of pipelines from Canada to increase the domestic supply of oil and refined products?
Well, one thing, and I think we should be clear on this, it's not the pipeline issue that's caused the current affordability challenge that we have.
I'm not
on
asking
oil
for that.
or natural gas
Do you support
side of things.
the construction?
So when I would
Yes or
look at
no?
any energy infrastructure, I would look at.
Let me go on to the next
does
question.
it promote
If I'm-
security? Does
If I'm
it
not
promote
going to get the
affordability?
answer, I only have a certain amount of time. Did DOE conduct an analysis to evaluate the energy security impacts of canceling the Keystone XL permit?
So that was before my time. I'm sure there was some analysis. I should say, I don't know what analysis was done.
I'm amazed that Secretary Granholm, having been in front of us before, last year, and asking questions about the Keystone pipeline, Line 5 pipeline as well, that you weren't prepped to respond to questions that you know we would ask, because there's great concern because it impacts my district and many other districts. Let me ask you this question. Did DOE warn the White House that canceling the Keystone XL pipeline would lead to job losses and energy prices increases? Have you heard that?
So I don't have any knowledge of that analysis or what
That's
that
amazing.
analysis would have said.
What precedent does Keystone XL set for other cross-border pipelines and electric transmission facilities?
So again, I don't think the pipeline issue is the affordability issue that you and other members have flagged as a primary concern and that we're working on in this administration. We're looking to use whatever tools we've got in the near term.
And it ain't working.
To deal with
It
the
ain't
supply
working.
and, well, we have 4.5
Look at the
billion
gas, the
on
price
LIHEAP.
at the pump. Look at the price on my farm constituents as they're trying to dry late season harvest and the cost of propane. The Canadians are filing a claim under NAFTA to recover $15 billion in economic damages caused by President Biden's meritless decision to revoke the Keystone XL pipeline permit. I'm concerned that American taxpayers will be forced to pay this penalty, another casualty of the Biden administration's anti-fossil fuel agenda. In the few seconds that I have left, in your response to Congressman Latta and also Ranking Member Upton, you indicated that DOE hasn't conducted any analysis to determine the impact of closing Line 5. If that's the case, and the administration ought to be having from the Department of Energy consultation, advice that deals with energy in this country, it amazes me that that is not happening. And regardless of whether you think you have priority or responsibility for that, the consultation to this administration to give them the reality of what energy resources are needed and how to get them to our people and do it in the safest way possible. In fact, the way it was done before January 20th. With that, I'll yield back.
The time is up. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the great state of California, Ms. Matsui, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I also want to say thank you for your many years of service, and I look forward to working with you the rest of this term. And I'm looking with curiosity as to what your next chapter of your life will be. I look forward to working with you there. I'm sure it'll be exciting. And I want to thank both witnesses for being with us here today. Deputy Secretary Turk, your testimony identifies many ways in which the Department of Energy engages with industry to address cybersecurity threats. Yes or no, do any of those programs result in mandatory enforceable cybersecurity standards?
So FERC is a part of DOE, an independent part of DOE, and FERC has responsibility with NERC for electricity bulk power in terms of the mandatory standards. And we help FERC and we help TSA and we help others on their mandatory standards.
Okay, I'm looking ahead also to see what other enforceable cybersecurity standards do we need to protect critical energy infrastructure?
So I've certainly come to the conclusion, having dealt with cybersecurity more than I thought I would, frankly, as Deputy Secretary of Energy over my first year, a little less than first year. And I've come to the conclusion we do need mandatory standards across the board when it comes to critical infrastructure. It's just too important. We can't just rely on every company doing what they should do, and we need to have some baseline mandatory standards. So electricity on the FERC and NERC side, pipelines, refineries, throughout the value chains, doing it in a common sense way, doing it with an awful lot of discussion with the private sector, as NERC does, as FERC does, as we do from the DOE side, but we just need to be prepared. So we absolutely need those mandatory standards, in my opinion.
Well, great, thank you. Looking ahead, I'm excited by the potential for offshore wind development off California's coast, but it's important for the stakeholders to have an opportunity to provide input into the development of this nascent industry. And that's why I was thrilled to see this administration announce last week that it will be investing in building a better and more reliable electric grid, including for offshore wind. Deputy Secretary Turk and Chairman Glick, can you speak to both DOE and FERC's respective role in that initiative? And how will your agencies use their respective or their experience engaging with stakeholders to ensure that our government's approach to offshore wind transmission is collaborative and inclusive? Deputy Secretary Turk.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for flagging offshore wind. I think the potential for offshore wind is huge. We've got a 30 gigawatt target by 2030 in this administration. I think we should be even thinking more bold than that and more, even more numbers than that, certainly beyond 2030. The capacity factor for offshore wind is higher than onshore wind. It balances out a number of parts to the clean energy generation piece to it. We're spending an awful lot of time, including in our national labs, on the innovation and the cost reduction side, including for floating offshore wind, which would be so important for California and off our West Coast. And then we're working with FERC, with others on the transmission side. Just as you rightfully flagged, we need to make sure we're building that infrastructure so that we can bring those offshore capacities into the fold and have them be an incredibly important, reliable, resilient part of our energy infrastructure.
Absolutely. Chairman Glick, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Masui, and I appreciate the question. We are going to be providing technical assistance to the Department of Energy in terms of carrying out its grid initiative, in particular with issues related to offshore wind, such as interconnecting offshore wind facilities to the grid, vitally important for the development of those technologies. Secondly, we actually have our own grid reform initiative underway in which we are hoping to establish a regulatory, reforming our regulations with regard to transmission. One of the things we're really focusing on, what's needed to access this what's undoubtedly going to be a substantial demand in terms of offshore wind, both in terms of the East Coast, but also, as you mentioned, off the West Coast. And clearly, we're going to need to figure out what's the most efficient way to build these transmission facilities. Do you build one transmission facility that accesses and collects power from a bunch of different offshore wind facilities, or do you do it on a case-by-case basis, building a line out to each individual offshore wind generating farm? And those are the type of issues we're going to be dealing with in terms of our transmission reform initiative.
Okay, well, in addition to offshore wind, what lessons can we take from climate and cybersecurity incidents in the past year to ensure that the transmission and deployment of new clean energy sources is safe and reliable?
So I think clearly, if you look at the situation in Texas with extreme cold, if you look at the situation in the West Coast with regard to extreme heat and wildfires, if you look at with regard to obviously Hurricane Ida that took place and the devastation that occurred there, we are going to need to make the electric grid much more resilient than it currently is to address and withstand some of these extreme weather conditions. And we are actually engaged in that. We've opened up a docket. We've held a technical conference, which is our version of a congressional hearing. And we're looking at what initiatives, working with our colleagues to consider what initiatives that we can pursue to essentially encourage utilities to make their grid more resilient towards to extreme weather conditions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I yield back.
Yield back. Now recognizing the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back. I've enjoyed serving with you. Let me just say this, that the SPR release amounted to a blip in gasoline and diesel prices. Prices did go up, as Mr. Turk said, and will continue to go up as demand increases throughout the winter months. But it will go back down. They'll go down when the weather warms and demand decreases, at least for a little while, until we get into the summer vacation travel season. Then demand goes up and prices will go up as supplies are used up. But one thing the administration did was acknowledge that these are basic economics of supply and demand. The way to address this energy crisis is by increasing supply, not stifling it, which is Democrat policy, stifling energy production in this country. Now, the title of this hearing is Pipeline Reliability, but Democrats really don't like pipelines. That's obvious. They shut down the Keystone Pipeline. They shut down the pipeline gentleman from Michigan talked about. In fact, they shut down the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. There's an article here that says that Congressional Progressive Caucus have been successful fighting restrictions of natural gas production through fracking and blocking natural gas pipelines, including Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Senator Sanders celebrated efforts by progressives to cancel the ACP. Another example of Democrats not liking pipelines is the fact that there is no pipeline really taking available natural gas from Marcellus up to New England states. The lack of the pipeline requires, because they have a thirst for energy in New England, but they don't like looking at the wind turbines off their coastline. They don't want pipelines because they think that gas might be frack gas, which they don't like, so they're going to import gas from Russia and Africa and other places, import it to the United States. LNG ships sit in the Boston Harbor, providing dirty Russian gas, African gas, to New England. The thirst is still there for the energy. The thirst to use natural gas is still there. They just don't want American gas through a pipeline, reliable or not, as the title of this hearing is. Mr. Glick, are you familiar with the letter sent to you by over 40 Democrats on 5 January 2022?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I've got the letter here, and it raises concern with the effect that anticipated increases in heating and energy costs will have on their constituents this winter. We're all concerned about costs that energy costs have on our constituents. Now, I agree with another point in the letter, that low-income households face a higher burden when dealing with increased energy costs. In fact, Republicans have talked about this for a long time. There are certain sources of energy that cost more to produce, and that's wind and solar and other things. So their letter addresses that. The letter demands FERC investigate whether market manipulation rather than environmental agenda or supply constraints is causing natural gas prices to rise over 30% on average for consumers last year. You're not supposed to use the word hypocrisy in Congress. I was told that when I first came here, but this is very hypocritical because there's same policies of limiting offshore drilling, ending leases, not wanting to have hydraulic fracturing, not having pipelines to bring the gas where the need and demand is, using dirtier burning Russian gas to heat in the homes and produce electricity. All that's hypocritical. It's also hypocritical to try to say that there's market manipulation when the administration is shutting down production in this country, while at the same time promoting energy sources that cost more to produce. And that cost is pushed down to the lower income people that they're talking about here. Hypocrisy at its finest. You know, the Biden administration's revoked the permit on Keystone Pipeline, halted all new federal oil and gas leases, greenlighting the completion of Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Another hypocritical thing. Same Democrats are concerned with high energy prices for their constituents, championing blocking our natural gas pipelines. It's just amazing. So, Mr. Glick, do you agree that pipelines are the safest method to transport oil and gas?
That we are not in the business of examining safety of natural gas pipeline transportation.
Well, I do. I'll just stop you there. I get it. We have an abundance of natural gas here in the United States. Marcellus, Bakken, Barnett, Eagle Ford. I could go on and on. I also think through innovation, not overregulation of government mandates in the energy sector, we can continue to lead the world in oil and gas production as well as reduce emissions. I think Europe is going to find that them being beholden on Russia for their energy sources, once the Nord Stream 2 adds to the Nord Stream 1 pipeline that brings gas there, and Vladimir Putin continues to use that as a lever of policy and political influence, they're going to wish they had U.S. LNG ships and terminals to offload that in Europe. Anyway, I'm out of time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman, Texas, Mr. Vinkie.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I want to thank Chairman Glick and Deputy Secretary Turk for being here today, too, to answer questions. Over the past year, we have seen many events, including some tragic ones in my home state of Texas, that really show the importance of reliable energy. I wrote a letter to FERC last year, and I support the joint inquiry by FERC and NERC to investigate operations of the bulk power system during the storm that we had. And I think there is a need to have a real conversation about the benefits and challenges of greater interconnections between ERCOT and the rest of the country. Electricity, as all of us know, is essential as food and water. And we can't have reliable electricity if we do not have reliable natural gas. Electric gas coordination is critical, and I think FERC has a role to play in some regulation over interstate pipelines and increasing transparency. This legislation addresses that and directly addresses one of the issues laid out in the FERC NERC report in response to Winter Storm Uri. It is also critical that as we address the problem of the Texas blackout, that we take a serious look at the rest of the infrastructure that supports our electric grid, including natural gas production and transmission. As many of you know, Texas, we're abundant with natural resources, including natural gas, that helps fuel our economy and keep us competitive globally. It is all the more important that we take action to ensure these resources are there when we need them most, like during the historically cold winter storm that we had. While the legislation in front of us will address some of the concern, a lot of the problems that we're facing in Texas with constrained natural gas supply were related to disruptions upstream, particularly with frozen wellheads. And I was hoping that Chairman Glick could describe the extent of FERC's jurisdiction over interstate pipelines. In particular, can you speak to FERC's oversight of 311 service and Henshaw pipelines?
So thank you very much for the question, Mr. VC. So we have authority over siting interstate natural gas pipelines under the Natural Gas Act. We also have some authority over regulation of the transportation rates. And primarily, we have authority over the jurisdiction over interstate pipelines, over transportation of natural gas over interstate natural gas pipelines. But there are also intrastate natural gas pipelines, including some in Texas, that actually also provide some interstate service. And so in those cases, we also regulate the rates pursuant to Section 311 of, I think, the Natural Gas Policy Act.
Given FERC exercises limited jurisdictional oversight over 311 service and Henshaw pipelines based on states' oversight of both, does FERC assess or confirm that such state oversight is sufficient?
No, we don't have the authority to do that, but you're exactly right. Those facilities are primarily subject to, I believe, the Texas Railroad Commission in Texas.
Given that we know that there's a lack of weatherization of natural gas assets, was a documented problem during Winter Storm Uri, could the gas supply shortages and subsequent issues during Winter Storm Uri have been avoided if there was some additional visibility into intrastate pipelines?
Thank you for the question. I don't believe so. I think the major issues were essentially there were two issues. There was weather conditions, which essentially those production facilities and those processing facilities for natural gas froze. Secondly, those other facilities that were still operational lost their power. There wasn't essentially a system set up, and I think Texas is now looking at that to make sure they're not cut off when there are rolling blackouts, that those facilities are not cut off. So I think that's where those were essentially where the responsibilities lie in terms of the impact and what caused the blackouts in Texas. I don't know. Yeah.
What if there were capacity postings for interstate pipelines similar to the bulletin boards available for interstate pipelines? Do you think that generators could have been prepared like that?
I think generators would have had to have more insight, essentially, as I mentioned earlier, to have more transparency into what's going on in the natural gas side, would essentially allow generators to go out and purchase natural gas elsewhere instead of at the last minute, which certainly caused some of the problems and drove up prices in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you back?
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your presence will be missed. I wish you well. I've been sitting here listening to the responses from the witnesses, and I'm kind of stuck somewhere between perplexed and confused and ashamed at how unwilling you are to give a straight answer to a straight question, and how little you seem to know about some of the subject matter. I mean, you were asked about pipeline safety. I don't care if that's your area of expertise or not. You ought to know that the safety record for pipelines is impeccable. 99.999% safe. It is by far, without question, except apparently by you two guys, the safest means of transporting energy. It's also the least expensive. And that's a big, big deal for American families. As I've pointed out many times on this committee, I grew up dirt poor, so I have a real burden for low-income families and what they're experiencing right now, particularly going into this winter. We've already had 2 snows in Alabama, which is a little bit remarkable, that people are literally going to be choosing between eating and heating because they can't afford their energy. You saw what's happened in Europe over the last few years as they've pivoted away from natural gas and tried to go to almost all renewables, particularly in the UK. I think it was either the winter of 2016-17 or 17-18, they had almost 17,000 people that they classified as excess winter deaths because they couldn't adequately heat their homes. I mean, is that the kind of policy that this administration supports? Mr. Glick?
I can speak for FERC, I can't speak for the administration since we're an independent agency, but I will say this, that our responsibility is to ensure that rates in terms of transportation of fuel and in terms of electricity, transportation, and generation within our jurisdiction is the rates are just and reasonable. And so the answer is it's not acceptable when rates go up extremely high. And we've taken a number of initiatives over the years to reduce, over the last several years, to try to reduce energy prices.
But here's what the administration's doing, and you made this point. You said demand is up, supply is down. That was your answer, wasn't it? That was your point.
Deputy Secretary, but I agree with that.
Okay. Deputy Secretary Turk made that point. Okay, here's the thing. If you understand that price is a function of supply and demand, when you shut off the construction of a major pipeline like Keystone XL, when you threaten to shut down other pipelines, when you restrict access to energy resources that were making us energy independent, you create a situation with Russia and OPEC where the president's having to go hat in hand on bended knee to ask them to increase production because the supply is now affected. Do you understand that? Apparently you understand that, Deputy Secretary.
So just to be clear.
I don't want a long drawn out answer. I've only got a minute and a half left. Just do you understand it?
What's thrown us out of whack here in the near term is COVID. When demand went way down, production then went way down on oil and gas. The economy's roaring back, and production is not kept up with that.
But the first thing this
So that's where we've
administration
got
did was shut down the construction of Keystone XL and restrict access to energy resources on federal lands. You took zero action to address the demand issue, which is going to continue to be an issue, and you basically gave a geopolitical windfall to Russia. And that brings me back to this other point about how insane these policies are, considering the conditions that we face right now, with an adversarial Russia, and I believe an enemy in China, and adversaries in the Middle East, and making us more dependent on foreign oil because we have policies that are preventing us from constructing the infrastructure that we need, that is the safest, most economical infrastructure for energy delivery, and shutting ourselves down from, cutting ourselves off from access to the resources that we have to keep prices down, to keep families whole in sense of their economic wholeness, and in regard to our national security. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chair has been made aware that the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, has returned. Mr. Pallone, you're for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rush. I wanted to ask Chairman Glick, your testimony explains that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, is empowered to issue reliability standards for the electric industry, but there's no comparable organization empowered to issue reliability standards for the gas industry. So how does the status quo affect FERC's ability to implement the recommendations from the recent FERC-NERC joint report on lessons from Storm Uri, which identified needed reliability standards for both electric and gas industries? Does it mean that FERC can implement the recommended standards for the electric industry but not for the gas industry?
Essentially, yes. FERC, working along with NERC, are working to try to implement as many of the recommendations as we can, but we don't have authority to implement the recommendations regarding natural gas reliability.
All right, then let me ask Deputy Secretary Turk. Section 215 of the Federal Power Act also empowers NERC to issue cybersecurity standards that are necessary to maintain the reliable operation of the bulk power system. From DOE's vantage point as the sector-specific agency responsible for the energy industry, does NERC's success in issuing cybersecurity standards for the electric industry demonstrate that the proposed Energy Product Reliability Organization could perform a similar function for the oil and gas sector?
So we think the FERC-NERC model has worked quite well in the electricity and the bulk power market. And again, TSA has put some mandatory standards on the books for a year, emergency standards for the pipeline, but it doesn't cover refineries, it doesn't cover other parts of the chain, and it's only for a year as well. And so,
But do you think that this proposed agency could perform a similar function for oil and gas, the oil and gas sector?
So again, it's up for Congress to decide who has what authorities, and we're happy to have further conversations on the regime that's in place that makes the most sense in this place. I will say FERC and NERC have done a very good job on the electricity bulk power side.
Okay. Now let me go back to Chairman Gluck. The Electric Reliability Organization, NERC, was the product of bipartisan work by members of this committee and ultimately passed as part of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 in a Republican Congress and signed by a Republican president. And that idea has withstood the test of time and demonstrates that industry-led stakeholder processes subject to FERC oversight can establish meaningful reliability standards that protect the reliability of the bulk power system. So given that this proposed Energy Product Reliability Organization is expressly modeled on the Electric Reliability Organization, do you think that the industry-led stakeholder process established by Chairman Rush's legislation can likewise be a successful mechanism for protecting the reliability of the oil and gas infrastructure?
I believe so. The electricity model has worked very well with the legislation you mentioned created in 2005, and I believe a similar model would work on the with regard to pipeline reliability.
All right. Let me just say, I don't know. I wanted to comment on my Republican colleagues, and there's some of them here and some on the that are virtual. But I guess I don't like to criticize you guys, but you continually criticize today the Biden administration's move to tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to address energy prices. And I do think that was significant and was necessary. And so I don't really understand why that criticism is taking place. But I do want to say that I support the Biden administration's efforts. And I also want to, with regard to the SPRO, and I also want to highlight that Republicans on this committee used the SPRO as a pay-for when they drafted the 21st Century Cures bill, which I also supported. And so, you know, if we can use the SPRO to pay for healthcare legislation, why do you all of a sudden oppose using it to address energy prices? I'm not looking for a response, but I have to comment on the fact that, you know, I thought that made a lot of sense. And I don't really understand the criticism of it. That's just my comment. And I'm not asking for you to comment, but if you want to, you can. Otherwise, I'm going to yield back. All right, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
When you was back, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Arizona. School for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I wish you the best in your future endeavors. My questions are from Chairman Glick, for Chairman Glick. Chairman Glick, I'm concerned that FERC is unfairly second-guessing final decisions that the commission made under the prior chairman. For example, FERC recently issued 5 notices of intent to prepare new environmental impact statements and projects for which FERC already determined that final environmental assessments were sufficient. So going forward, Chairman Glick, can the public and regulated industry rely on FERC to make final decisions and then stick with the decisions?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Lesko. I would disagree with the premise of the question. Actually, the FERC never did say that those previous environmental reviews were sufficient. Those were staff analyses, and they didn't make that determination either. Basically, we're doing what the courts are requiring us to do, and I want to use as examples. Over the last several years, the courts have repeatedly said FERC is not doing this right. We're not, and other agencies too. They're saying FERC and other agencies are not essentially reviewing pipelines sufficiently in terms of the environmental impacts. And what happens is we issue our orders in the past. The courts send it back to us. It takes several years to go back and do the additional reviews. And what all it does is it costs extra money, and in many cases, it causes pipelines to cancel those projects. It's happened in the past. So what we're trying to do is follow what the law requires and what the courts are telling us. And so we're trying to do, if you look at the last several court cases, they're essentially saying we have to do an environmental impact statement to review the environmental impacts of these particular projects. And so we're doing so. In the long run, it's actually going to expedite the process, not slow it down.
Thank you for the answer. My next question is also for you. In Order 871, which was recently implemented this year, FERC changed well-settled practice and created new project risks. Order 871 significantly restricts what companies may do while requests for rehearing of FERC certificate orders are pending, which can delay a pipeline's access to the land necessary to conduct project surveys for environmental and cultural resource permits, land acquisition, and construction. The order also announces a presumptive stay on all future pipeline certificates pending rehearing proceedings, which is contrary to congressional direction in the National Gas Act. Further, the order is not clear about what a pipeline needs to prove to lift the stay. The order provides incentive for project opponents to seek rehearing to delay projects. We all know that building infrastructure projects has taken longer and longer in recent years. How much delay do you expect FERC's recent Order 871 to add to pipeline development timelines, considering that most of these projects already have multiple years to design, permit, and build?
So Order 871 essentially was a response to the courts, which essentially told the FERC that we weren't handling the pipeline siting process sufficiently in terms of ensuring that landowners have their day in court. And I want to quickly explain, under the Natural Gas Act, when you get a certificate of public convenience and necessity, you automatically, then the pipeline developer can automatically go to court and actually take land by an eminent domain. Where those people, landowners and others that are challenging the commission's decision to issue the certificate, it takes a little while because of the way the Natural Gas Act is written to get to court and as we challenge those particular decisions. So what 871 says is, we're going to delay the effective date of the certificate to give those parties enough time to make their challenge at FERC and then go to court. And if the court then stays the commission's decision, that's one thing. If they don't, then they can go and move forward with with taking land by eminent domain, but it's all about making sure that landowners have their day in court before land is taken by eminent domain.
How much time do you think that will add onto the already long time it takes to get permitting?
If any time, and I can't give you a specific answer, I think very little, in large part because the process, we limited under 871B, what the commission did is limited this time period to 90 days. So essentially, you have to wait 90 days or earlier if the commission acts on the rehearing proposal earlier before you can actually go to court and seek to take land by eminent domain. But that's early on in the process. It's not necessarily going to delay the development of the pipeline itself because it takes a long time. Even if you take the land, you have to get the other permits you need from state agencies and other federal agencies.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, you leave quite a legacy here in Congress and back in your home community. And I know you're not done yet. And thank you to our witnesses, Chairman Glick, and to Deputy Secretary Turk for being here. You know that the deadly Texas freeze last February demonstrated how important it is that we weatherize our existing infrastructure and do everything we can to blunt the higher costs and risks fueled by the climate crisis. Now, this Congress has acted on several strategies to lower the cost for consumers and businesses and make the grid more reliable, especially upgrading and expanding our electric grid, investing in energy efficiency, conservation, distributed clean energy resources, and clean backup storage. And today we're focused on the pipeline infrastructure angle here and the reliability standards. Now there's an untold story that a lot of people don't know, but there was an article in the Texas Monthly that I believe it came out just recently that the gas industry received $11 billion in windfall profits from the Texas freeze. Without reliability standards, the gas industry will continue to reap windfall profits while leaving customers out in the cold. And it's not just Texans that are impacted. The gas spot price went up 30-fold in Southern California. Minnesotans had to pay an extra $800 million. So Chairman Glick, tell us more about the cost of consumers in other parts of the country having to cover the cost because of the failure of the Texas grid and the gas wells.
I appreciate the question, Ms. Castor, and in fact, I recently read that article as well. And I would say that that's if we're talking about impact on consumer bills, the bill increases we've seen as a result of what happened in Texas and surrounding states last winter, by many folds, we're talking about much higher increases than the other rate issues that we've been talking about today. And in large part, it was because of simple supply and demand. Gas production facilities, Texas supplies a lot of natural gas around the country. Gas supply facilities in Texas froze, many of them froze. Many of them became inoperable, as did the processing stations, and so there wasn't enough gas to go around. So what gas was left, both in Texas and elsewhere, the prices jumped dramatically. And you mentioned some of the, we're talking 800%, 700%. Different states had significant, enormous rate increases. So the benefit of, I think, of the bill that we're talking about today, or the concept of ensuring the reliability of the gas infrastructure, if that gas infrastructure was more reliable and the facilities didn't freeze and they didn't get cut off from electricity supply, we would have seen rate increases would have been much smaller, only basically due to the fact that it was cold and there was more demand for gas because of that. And so I think this is not only an important perspective from reliability and in certain terms of making sure that people's lives are protected, which is obviously the most important, but it's also in terms of the pocketbook. And this legislation, I think, or the idea behind this legislation, will help promote what I believe will keep energy prices, both electricity and natural gas prices, much lower if we have a more reliable natural gas pipeline system.
I agree. Deputy Secretary Turk, would you like to add your views?
Yeah, happy to, and thanks, Chairwoman, for all your leadership in the Climate Committee in particular and all else. So I think you're absolutely right to focus on the costs of climate change to American consumers. $145 billion last year is one estimate from extreme weather exacerbated or caused by climate change. So we need to look at all of our tools to make sure there's not manipulation in the market and to assure affordability, including on heating for those consumers who are having challenges. And the price of gas at the pump right now is too high. We think it's too high. This administration thinks it's too high. That's why we're doing the kinds of things we're doing. We've got $4.5 billion in LIHEAP. Congress appropriated $21.5 in emergency rental assistance that's going to help pay energy bills along those lines. We've gotten 14 utility companies to avoid shutoffs for those consumers who are having challenges during this COVID crisis. So we absolutely have to keep our eye on that affordability issue.
Yeah, and I think Chairman Rush's Energy Product Reliability Act fills that very important gap, whether we're talking about cybersecurity or we're talking about the rising costs and risk fueled by the climate crisis. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rush and Ranking Member Upton, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before our committee. The bill before us today misses the mark in addressing issues facing my constituents this winter. Rental assistance helps pay the rent. It does not help pay the utility bill. Right now, families across Indiana's 6th district are paying more to heat their home, cook their meals, and drive to work. Unfortunately, H.R. 6084 is currently written is an unworkable solution in search of a problem. Our discussions today about reliable energy distribution for electricity generation should focus on access to abundant fuel supplies at an affordable price, as both of you have mentioned today. If the majority and the Biden administration want to push the electrification of our economy, particularly our transportation economy, we would need more production of natural gas and expanded capacity of new pipelines to meet increased electricity demands. It's clear, however, that construction of new interstate natural gas pipelines under this administration could grow increasingly difficult, like Line 5 that Chairman Ranking Member Upton asked about earlier. For a state like Indiana that does not have substantial local resources of natural gas, interstate pipelines serve as an economic lifeline. Having spent my career in the energy distribution industry, I know firsthand that pipelines are the safest, most reliable form of transportation. A robust and competitive market for fuel distribution is the best way to ensure businesses and consumers have reliable access to affordable energy. Adding a regulatory regime that oversteps state and local authorities, like H.R. 6084, isn't the answer, and I'm not real sure that it clears things up and keeps things out of court. In particular, I'm concerned that this bill could expand federal authorities into intrastate pipelines that are already regulated by my Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. When I speak with local distribution companies like Southeastern Indiana Gas Company and Milan, they're not asking for federal government to layer on additional regulations. A company like Southeastern needs access to gas supplies at a competitive price so they can offer affordable services to Hoosiers in our community. When we consider our future energy outlook, I'm concerned that vulnerabilities to reliable fuel transportation could arise from a lack of supply in an overregulated market, not because FERC needed more broad and unchecked authority, personnel, or money. Chairman Glick, it appears that this administration has a singular focus on the complete electrification of our economy, from the cars we drive to the stovetops we use. As we have discussed today, if the goal is electrification, natural gas will need to play a significant role. Expanded pipeline capacity will be all but required to meet the increased electricity demands of our economy. The agenda of this administration may only deter necessary investments into new pipeline construction. Reliable financial investments into new pipelines will require certainty of a stable market and regulatory environment. However, competition between federal and state oversight authorities could cloud the regulatory future and introduce more uncertainty to potential investors. If certainty is what people need to make investments, how will a regulatory regime like that of 6084 impact the cost of constructing new interstate or intrastate pipelines to meet increasing electricity demands? And are you supportive of new natural gas pipelines?
First of all, I would say that thanks for the question, Mr. Pence. I would say that first of all, I don't think it would add any cost. This legislation being enacted would not have any impact in terms of the construction of natural gas pipelines or the cost associated with the construction of natural gas pipelines. It's really focused. This legislation and the idea is really focused primarily on.
But wouldn't you agree a pipeline company, some of the increased regulations for cybersecurity may be additional expenses for their company? Which would reduce the amount of dollars they have available for investments.
Long and the short term, I think, and we've seen this on the electricity side. I think if you talk to all the many of the electricity companies, they would argue the fact that we now have mandatory reliability standards on the electricity side have actually reduced their cost because they become more reliable. They don't have to buy backup power. Sometimes they don't have to, to the extent a facility is hardened, they don't have to go out and build the facility over and over again every time a hurricane lands in their shores. And so I think actually in the long term, we're talking about a more reliable system, making sure that the actually cost to consumers go down.
Well, you and I disagree on that. I think more regulation costs more money, but I thank you for your time, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Schrader, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your historic leadership of this committee and your tenure in Congress. Mr. Glick, just to get a little perspective here, what has been the trend in pipeline failures and pipeline incidents over the last decade or so? That is starting to increase? Is that?
I'll have to get that information for you for the record. I'm not aware of that, Mr. Schrader.
Okay. That's kind of important because, if we need to change the regulatory framework, it would be, I assume, because we're having more problems.
If I could interject just quickly, I think we've seen, again, as we saw in Texas last winter, I think there are problems in terms of natural gas infrastructure, especially with greater incidences of extreme weather. In terms of pipelines themselves, I think I have to come up with some figures for you, and we'll get back to you.
Okay, that'd be helpful. Is there evidence that the pipeline companies are not maintaining the pipelines adequately, not doing their due diligence?
I don't have any evidence of that, no.
Okay. That also seems kind of important to me to help make a decision. What is the agency right now doing to ensure pipeline safety? I mean, that's obviously an area of expertise for DOE. What are your goals there?
So the authority over pipeline safety is primarily given to PHMSA. But we do have authority when we site a new interstate natural gas pipeline. We have authority to ensure that the pipeline essentially is going to be in the public interest. So we do review the safety elements up front, before it's constructed, to make sure it's planned in the right way and so on. But once the project goes into operation, those issues are handed over to PHMSA.
So then we have PHMSA doing a lot of that stuff already. Okay. What is the industry doing to increase the safety of their pipelines? Some are older. You've been around quite some time.
I would recommend talking to the industry, but I would say that what we hear from them is they say they're making increased investments to deal with older pipelines. We know the pipeline system is aging around the country. And then on cybersecurity, what they tell us is they're making certain investments to address cybersecurity threats as well to the pipelines. I would say, though, there's always a weak link in the system when you're talking about what utilities are doing on a voluntary basis. And I would go back again. The recommendations were made in 2011. There were voluntary recommendations. This is on the power side, but to weatherize power plants. And generators said, "Oh yeah, we're going to do it. We're going to invest. We're going to make sure that our power plants are next time the cold weather comes around, we're going to be ready." And the fact is, they weren't, because they didn't want to make the investments that their competitor wasn't willing to make. And so I think that's the lesson we need to learn when we consider whether there needs to be mandatory standards on the pipeline side as well.
Well, it sounds like we need oversight, and I would assume the Department of Energy, you guys have regulatory authority to do that to some degree, or the states, if it's intrastate, the states would have that authority and could be brought up to speed on that. I have some concerns about NERC in this space, to be honest with you. We've had some catastrophic wildfires out in Oregon and whole West Coast for that matter, parts of Colorado. It's been devastating. And I don't see where NERC's province seems to be playing heavily in that area to prevent those types of catastrophic wildfires. I will say Congress has stepped in many cases. We passed a bill that myself and Representative LaMalfa from California put together that is hopefully now going to be implemented, that talks about making it easier for power companies to do hazardous tree removal along power rights of way. That's critical, as we've seen in these recent wildfires. I don't care if it's California, Oregon, you name it, to get those rights of way cleaned up. Sometimes it's the federal agencies like the Forest Service and BLM not doing their due diligence or making it more difficult. Sometimes it's the companies, and our bill hopefully will do that, and I would assume your agency will monitor that work pretty closely. One of the nice things that we've done here most recently in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed here this year, nice bill, both parties, everyone involved, is set aside money for wildfire mitigation in our energy network to improve transmission, to make it more reliable. There are grants provided for different companies, different jurisdictions to apply for. What is the timeliness in getting that money out the door? And I don't know if that's a question for you, Mr. Glick, or you, Mr. Turk.
So this is a game changer, just as you said. The investments in the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, whether it's wildfires, whether it's reliability more generally in the electricity sector, $16 billion. So we're working right now to get all that set up. Some of it requires some new offices. We've said we need to hire 1,000 additional people to make sure that we're doing this in the way we should be doing it. And if anybody who's listening wants to come work at the Department of Energy, we'd be happy for them to apply. So we're going to try to do this quickly. We can't wait, whether it's wildfire risks, cyber risks. And we certainly feel like there is a necessary mandatory minimum that everyone should be doing, cyber hygiene in particular, on that front. And even if many parts of the industry are doing what they should be doing, if some parts aren't, that's a vulnerability from a national security, from a national infrastructure perspective. And we need to, from our perspective, make sure we've got that foundation, that floor, then we can build upon.
Just last comment, wildfire season's coming, so please hire the people and get the rules of the road written. Thank you. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Some of years back, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I go into my questions on pipelines, I'd just like to address why I personally was critical of the release of the strategic oil reserves. And that is because the best case scenario was it was a cynical ploy for the administration to look like they were doing something for high energy costs. The worst case scenario is it shows a complete lack of knowledge by the administration, the most powerful country in the history of the world, as to how actually energy markets work. Because the month before they released the strategic oil reserve, WTI price was $81.48. The month after they released the strategic oil reserve, the price was $79.83. As of now, it's $84.93. The month before the strategic oil reserve was released, compared to the month after strategic oil reserve was released, gasoline went down by a whopping 1 cent. But don't worry about it, because right now, January, it's up 93 cents year over year. So these and it has real consequences, because now we fill the strategic reserve at a significantly higher price, costing taxpayers money. So that's just to be clear of where and why we would be critical of decisions like that. Within his first week of taking office, President Biden issued Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And amongst its many problematic provisions is Section 209, which requires agencies to target perceived fossil fuel subsidies and take steps to ensure that federal funding is not subsidizing certain energy sources. Aside from the fact that the president is intent on picking winners and losers at the expense of national security, reliability, and affordability, it has come to my attention that employees at the Department of Energy seem to have taken it upon themselves to inform various organizations that the department will not continue to support research in the fossil fuel space. Employees have referenced President Biden's executive order when advising about awards through fossil energy programs, implying the executive order precludes them from honoring certain awards. Mr. Turk, is it true that the department will no longer support research in fossil energy?
So we support research across the energy spectrum, including an awful lot of research, and we have more funding coming from the bipartisan infrastructure legislation on.
Well, let me be more
CCS, on
specific.
hydrogen, you
Does,
name it.
does the department support research in technologies like carbon capture and sequestration that result in emission reductions?
So we're absolutely investing in carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The department has for many years, and now we have $10 billion and more for CCUS demonstration programs in the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that we look forward to working with North Dakota and other states around the country on.
Well, and I want to turn specifically to programs utilized in North Dakota that have a substantial impact on fossil energy research and understand what the department will prioritize over the next year. The department's fiscal year 2022 budget zeroes out the unconventional fossil energy technologies budget line. This seems to be a huge mistake given the energy independence the United States has developed over the last decade. While the department is seeking to eliminate future funding for this program, will you commit to the department funding key unconventional energy projects that have already been awarded and are underway in North Dakota?
So I'd have to look at the particular projects that you're talking about to make sure I'm giving you a responsive answer. So happy to take that for the record or have a side conversation.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Through the Energy and Environmental Research Center in Grand Forks, North Dakota, it is integrally involved in the department's regional carbon sequestration partnership. With over 120 public and private sector stakeholders, the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership is laying the groundwork for permanent, safe, and practical underground storage of carbon dioxide from industrial facilities in the region. The department has worked with us in the past, and I'm hopeful that they will continue to honor their commitment to provide continuing funding for the regional partnership, including the Plains CO2 Partnership. In addition to working on carbon sequestration, the ERC has assembled a key test center for solid oxide fuel cells for the Department of Energy. It's anticipated through a previously approved proposal that this center will receive $2 million in the fiscal year 2022 to continue to support research efforts. Will the department commit to honoring the solid oxide fuel cells test center and other previously approved proposals?
So again, happy to get to you on the particulars. We don't yet have our FY22 budget. We're still on a CR, so it's difficult to plan those kinds of things. And let me underscore as well on the CCUS side, we have a North Dakotan, Brad Crabtree, who's the nominee to lead our Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Office, and we hope he's confirmed very quickly so he can help North Dakota and other states around the country.
Well, I think I speak for all of my colleagues in the House that says we'd like to have more of a say in confirmations, but that really happens on the north end of the Capitol. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the young lady from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for organizing this hearing today to discuss federal efforts to strengthen pipeline safety and reliability. And Chairman Rush, I also want to take a moment to recognize you at this first Energy Subcommittee hearing after your recent decision to retire from Congress. You have distinguished yourself over a lifetime of service to your beloved city of Chicago and to this nation, and our country is a better place because of your commitment to racial justice and dedication to ensuring that the most vulnerable among us are not left behind. As the May 2021 Colonial Pipeline cyber attack drove home, our nation's energy system is only as reliable as the security of the digital systems that serve as the backbone for America's energy distribution. And I'm pleased that the committee is reviewing the Energy Product Reliability Act, which will enhance the cybersecurity and reliability of our nation's energy infrastructure. Most Americans would be shocked to learn that the federal government has done little to ensure, excuse me, that our nation's pipelines are secure. As we saw after the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack, this failure to provide clear guidance to industry has a direct impact on consumers. Up and down the East Coast, gas prices surged because of this cyber attack, and Americans were left waiting in line to fill up their cars and paying more for the fuel they need. The results of future cyber attacks could be even worse. The North American Electricity Reliability Commission, NERC, has warned of potential winter electrical outages in New England due to constraints on natural gas supply. If the pipeline networks that supply our region with natural gas are compromised during a cold snap, the effects on electricity generation and home heating will be immediate. Chairman Glick, what would be the effects on New Hampshire if pipelines delivering natural gas to New England were compromised by a cyber attack?
Thanks for the question, Ms. Custer. So currently, New England is a significant portion of the New England electric generation facilities are fueled by natural gas. Some of them are dual fueled with also heating oil, for instance, or some sort of oil, but a lot of them are just fueled directly by natural gas. So that's a significant, I think it's like neighborhood of 18,000 megawatts or something like that in New England is fueled by natural gas. And so clearly, if there's a supply disruption with regard to pipelines, for instance, and those facilities can no longer run on a very cold day, in particular in the winter, that would certainly endanger the reliability of the electric grid in New England.
And will this bill, the Energy Product Reliability Act, improve the cybersecurity and reliability of pipelines that deliver natural gas to our region?
I think establishing some sort of mandatory standards process, such as we have on the electric grid side for interstate natural gas pipelines, in my opinion, would certainly enhance the reliability of the grid and reduce the threat of gas supply disruptions, which would also lead to electricity supply disruptions.
Thank you. Now, switching gears, this is an important opportunity to note how clean energy resources can help support a more reliable electric system. In a hearing earlier this year, David Hardy, the CEO of Ørsted America, gave testimony to this committee where he emphasized that offshore wind turbines are built to operate reliably in extreme winter climate. During the 2018 polar vortex, when New England faced an extreme cold snap, hydropower resources were held reserved to back up a strained energy system. And thanks to hydropower, the New England electric system stayed online. Mr. Turk, in the event a cyber attack limits natural gas supplies into New England, could a more diverse power generation portfolio that includes clean energy resources like offshore wind and hydro help prevent electricity shortfalls?
Well, the short answer is absolutely. And offshore wind can be incredibly important in that. Hydro can be important, and thank you for all your leadership with the 3 Rs and all your efforts on that front. We feel incredibly strongly hydro is such an important part of the equation. Storage is such an important part of the equation. Hydrogen, if we can get clean hydrogen at the volumes we'd like to get clean hydrogen. So there's a variety of diverse sources, and the infrastructure bill that was passed bipartisan from the Congress gives us new authority to try to push those out as quickly as we possibly can.
Great. Well, I can't do better than that. Very kind. Kudos to our 3 Rs. I call it a damn good idea. And I just use this moment to ask the chairman if we could schedule a subcommittee hearing in an energy subcommittee on hydro in the near future. And with that, I yield back. Oh, whoops.
Mr. Chairman, I think you're on mute.
I am on mute. And the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Marigon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing on pipeline reliability and for your work to elevate this issue. In the last year, we have seen the consequences of our country's dependence on fossil fuels, from the gas supply issues during the Texas winter storm power outages to the hacking of the Colonial Pipeline that threatened the energy supply of parts of the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic. America needs to aggressively transition all fossil fuels to clean energy for our climate, environmental justice, and our energy security. But while we work to reduce our dependence, residents and businesses can't afford the severe disruptions that can come with pipeline breaks, leaks, and cyber attacks. These disruptions also pose threats to workers, to our environment and our national security. We need improved reliability, safety, and environmental standards for our pipelines and accountability for when they are not followed. My first question is for you, Deputy Secretary Turk. In October of last year, there was a major oil spill caused by the rupture of an underwater pipeline 4.5 miles off the coast of Long Beach near my district. While the investigation is still ongoing, indications are a ship anchor disrupted the pipeline months before the spill was detected, and the leak could have been ongoing long before it was detected. It is also important to have reliability standards for offshore energy pipelines. Is that accurate? And how does your department work with the Department of Interior, which has primary jurisdiction over offline pipelines to ensure energy security and environmental hazards, such as leaks or breaks, can be detected?
Well, Congresswoman, let me just completely agree with you that we've got to go very, very ambitiously and aggressively on a full, diverse range of clean energy sources, good for our climate, good for affordability, good for resiliency and reliability. And at the same time, make sure that our existing energy infrastructure is secure, is safe, is reliable. We work hand in hand with the Department of Interior, not just on the underwater pipeline issue, but a variety of other key issues as well. And whether it's underwater pipeline or pipeline on land, certainly from our perspective, we need to have a minimum set of standards to make sure that all of our populations across the country, including those on the coast like yours in California, are protected.
Okay, are there any adequate federal standards in place to secure offshore energy infrastructure from hazards such as leaks or breaks in offshore pipelines that can devastate the environment?
So the chairman should certainly come in here as well. My understanding is there is some regulatory, at least on the safety side. I think PHMSA has some coverage, but maybe it's in tandem with some other parts of Interior as well on this particular issue. But again, this is one thing that's come up again and again on this hearing is avoiding a patchwork and making sure that we've got coherence. And what we focus on from the Department of Energy side of things is making sure we've got coherence across energy systems and across the whole parts of energy systems in particular. And we just need to make sure that that's the case for any infrastructure related to energy from our perspective. But Chairman, if you'd like to comment further on the existing authorities.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Just quickly, Congresswoman, I do believe that that PHMSA has a responsibility, but also the Interior Department shares responsibility with PHMSA over the safety of those particular facilities.
Right. Well, thank you. At least thank you for working with the Department of Interior. I believe it's important we have reliability standards, regardless of where the pipelines are, underwater or above ground. Deputy Secretary Turk, how vulnerable are offshore oil rigs to cyber attack, and what can be done at a federal level to improve the security of their computer systems?
So from our perspective, what we see in classified setting in the public reporting is there's a variety of threats, criminal gangs, ransomware, and state actors as well, across key parts of our energy infrastructure. And so offshore rigs are certainly part of the critical part of our key energy infrastructure as it currently exists, and we need to make sure they're safe, just like pipelines are safe, just like electricity is safe. So we can't have any weak links.
Oh, great. Thank you. Chairman Glick, I'm out of time, but what I'm going to do is submit my question on methane leaks from natural gas infrastructure to you, and we'll look forward to getting a response to that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chairman now recognizes the gentlelady from Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester. Oh, wait, no, I see, Mr.
Mr. Chairman, we have Mr. Carter here ready to go.
Okay. The chair now recognizes Mr. Carter for 5 minutes. Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for being here. I know that this hearing is supposed to be for pipeline reliability, but it's not often that we get the chairman of FERC as well as the number 2 man at Department of Energy in front of us. So instead of discussing the creation of a new level of bureaucracy for pipelines, we should be fighting the current energy crisis. Gentlemen, I want to read from the Department of Energy's website. The mission of the Energy Department is to ensure America's security and prosperity by addressing its energy, environmental, and nuclear challenges through transformative science and technology solutions. A year ago, the United States of America was energy independent. There are some of those who would say that we were energy dominant. We were actually exporting energy. And I would say that the Department of Energy was actually adhering to its mission pretty well at that time. You know, I'm old enough to remember the late 70s when we realized that we were too dependent on foreign countries for our energy needs, and we did something about it. We set out to achieve energy independence, and we achieved that. We did just that to the point, as I indicated just a second ago, that we actually were able to achieve energy dominance. But today, that's not the case. Energy prices have skyrocketed. The most obvious on my constituents is the prices at the pump. The Energy Information Agency has raised its outlook for gas for 2022, saying that we are at risk of hitting $4 a gallon as a national average. AAA last week said that gas prices in Georgia have increased to nearly $1 more than this time last year. Gentlemen, I have the honor and privilege of representing the entire coast of Georgia, including the 2 metro areas of Savannah and Brunswick. And they, in my district, have the highest average gas prices in the state, higher than even in the Atlanta metro area. Savannah and metro areas which are in my district, these 2 areas are home to 2 of the country's busiest ports, seaports, where we've seen firsthand how the energy crisis has exacerbated the supply chain crisis. American families and businesses are being crushed by expensive utility bills. Electricity is up over 6% in the last year, and natural gas is up over 25%. Also, energy costs are the top driver of the record inflation we see today. So families are feeling it everywhere. Deputy Secretary Turk, I want to ask you, considering the Department of Energy's mission, as I quoted before, what are you doing to ensure that American energy security and affordable energy for all Americans?
So thank you for the question, and I have to say I feel incredibly proud to be part of this Department of Energy and this administration. And I think we're pushing all the authorities that we have, all the funding streams that we have, including $62 billion in new funding authorities that the Congress has given us through the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, to build the diverse, secure, affordable, resilient energy supplies that we need in the future. Not just today, but 5 years, 10 years from now, to benefit all our U.S. citizens, all our U.S. people around our country. And prices are too high right now. COVID has thrown the supply and demand for oil and gas out of whack, and we're suffering from that. We've got a near-term problem. It's not caused by pipelines, it's not caused by other things, it's caused by COVID, and we're trying to deal with that. Our Strategic Petroleum Reserve is to try to shave that top part of that curve as our domestic supplies, other supplies around the world for oil catch up with where demand is, because we're now increasing our economy coming out of COVID, which is a great thing, but energy supplies have not matched up with that. In 2022, we will have the supplies meet the demand. We're just in a real tough spot right now, but absolutely, we're focused on affordability.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Turk, and with all due respect, you mentioned the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. Do you think it's important for the United States to maintain its energy independence?
So absolutely, and I think it should be important for Europe, for Japan, for other countries around the world.
Yeah, but we're not talking about Europe and Japan. We're talking about the United States of America. I remember former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying what a great asset it was to be able to travel to other foreign countries and know that we had energy dominance and energy independence. Yet we don't have it now. We've actually had to ask the Middle East to pump more oil in order to do it. You mentioned the Strategic Petroleum Reserves, and I know that the administration made available 50 million barrels of oil to lower prices for Americans. How much of an effect did that release from the SPR have on oil prices?
So just to be clear, energy security is also offshore wind and solar and wind and storage.
Understood.
And hydrogen.
That was not my
CCUS and
question.
Nuclear. On the SPR piece of it, what we designed was a carefully set a sale and an exchange tied together for the particular moment in time we are with the supply and demand disruption. On the exchange part, what we designed that to do is shave off that top part of the curve, provide some affordability, provide some additional affordability protection for American consumers who are paying too much at the pump. Completely agree with you on that. And the exchange means that oil and gas companies actually return more product into the SPRO on the back end of this. So it's good for the SPRO, good for consumers. Obviously, it's a huge oil economy and a huge oil market out there, and there's a lot of forces outside of our immediate control. But we're doing everything we can to promote affordability.
Is that what the SPR was intended for? Was to bring down prices like this?
So it's dealing with a supply challenge, a near-term supply challenge caused by COVID, and the SPR is one tool in the tool belt that I have to say we spent many months designing this particular exchange mechanism and feel like it's really, really fit for this moment.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I'll yield back.
For the record, let me say that these questions are from members who have waved on to the subcommittee, and so we're now entertaining questions from those members of Congress who waved on to the subcommittee. And with that said, the chair now recognizes the gentle lady from Texas, Mrs. Fletcher, for 5 minutes. Ms. Fletcher, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairman Rush. Thanks to you and Ranking Member Upton for holding this important hearing and for allowing me to participate. I'd like to thank the witnesses for taking the time to testify. Energy reliability is key to ensuring safety and security of our energy supplies and our communities. In my home state of Texas, we saw just last year the real-life impacts of supply disruption, the potential collapse of our grid during the coldest days of the year. And it really can't be overstated. Our fellow Texans, our fellow Americans froze to death in their homes. And I remain concerned looking at the minimal action we've seen from state legislators and our governor that Texas is not truly prepared for the next storm. And that's why this bill is a good starting point for a discussion on how to improve energy reliability. I think there's some improvements that can still be made, and I look forward to discussing those issues with our panelists today. And I have 2 issues I want to touch on in the time that I have. First, the need for developing new pipeline infrastructure. A significant energy reliability challenge is that permitting-related obstacles in some localities have prevented the expansion of pipeline infrastructure where it is needed. To my understanding, the proposed organization that we're talking about in the draft, some kind of EPRO organization would forbid the new reliability regulator from setting standards for adequacy of pipeline infrastructure. For example, ISO New England, which operates the electric power grid in New England, states that the region is vulnerable to pipeline interruptions because there has been tremendous growth in natural gas-fired generating capacity, but the natural gas pipelines that deliver low-cost shale gas into the region have not been expanded at a commensurate pace. And in the last few weeks, New England has had to resort to using fuel oil to meet their energy needs. Burning fuel oil is one of the least environmentally friendly sources of power generation. In 2020, 1% of power generation nationwide was from fuel oil. And in the last month, as much as 24% of New England's grid relied on fuel oil as a power source. So I want to ask both of our witnesses to quickly answer whether you agree with ISO New England that more pipeline capacity is needed to promote reliability in certain regions that currently have constraints. And also, if you could say whether you feel that a potential natural gas and pipeline reliability regulatory body, as discussed in this legislative draft, should include authority to look at pipeline capacity issues when considering overall reliability. And then I have a second issue I want to touch on as well. So if you could answer those questions, I would appreciate it.
So, Ms. Fletcher, if I could respond first, this is Rich Glick. So with regard to New England, I think the issue isn't whether they need new gas pipeline capacity. They need new capacity to get additional energy, whether it be through transmission lines or natural gas pipelines or building more generation in the region. The reason, and FERC actually has authority to site natural gas pipelines, interstate natural gas pipelines around the country. And one of the things we have to do is find out whether we have to determine whether the project is needed or not before issuing a certificate to authorize the pipeline. And in New England, the issue hasn't been necessarily government stopping or not permitting pipelines. The issue is pure economics. Natural gas pipeline developers don't want to build those pipelines unless the electric generator customers agree to take firm capacity, agree to pay them throughout the year for the pipeline capacity. But in fact, they only need the gas maybe 10 days out of the year when it's really cold. And so there's been a kind of the 2 ships passing in the night situation, really, with regard to electric generators and natural gas pipelines, which is why natural gas pipeline capacity hasn't been built in New England. With regard to the provision in 6084, it's very similar to provision that was in the electricity reliability language that was enacted in 2005, essentially forbidding NERC to order electric utility companies for building electric transmission capacity. And so I think there's an issue about usurping the state's jurisdiction to tell the utilities to build pipelines or build local distribution facilities. So it's really more of a jurisdictional issue as to who should have that responsibility to build pipeline capacity when it is needed.
In the interest of
thank you.
time, let me just agree with the chairman, and certainly New England is very complicated, but we need to work with our state, local utility, other colleagues to try to bring some fixes there, because it's just not right for the consumers who face those kind of prices and challenges.
Well, thank you for that quick answer. The 5 minutes does go quickly, so I will submit my second question for the record. But what I would like to know from you is whether a proposed reliability regulator should include a focus on issues at the wellhead like we saw in Texas during Winter Storm Uri. I will submit that question for the record. And Mr. Chairman, with that question, I have cited an article from Texas Monthly that Ms. Castor referenced earlier in the hearing. And I would love to seek unanimous consent to enter the Texas Monthly article into the record for this hearing. So I thank you again for letting me participate, and I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. That concludes the witness. And I certainly want to thank our witnesses for their participation in today's hearing. And I want to at this time remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, answered by the witnesses who have appeared. I ask each witness to respond promptly to such questions that you may receive. Before we adjourn, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record the following document.
Mr. Chairman, we've seen the list and we have no objection.
All right, no objection, without objection, so ordered. And at this time, the subcommittee stands adjourned.